Imagine this. It's the year 1327. The sun sets before you've finished chewing your last piece of bread, and you won't see it again until what feels like sometime next century. Snow falls like an uninvited guest who has no intention of leaving, and the wind whistles through the cracks of your wooden hut as though auditioning for a horror soundtrack. You pull your wool tunic tighter, but it feels like wearing damp carpet. Welcome, dear listener, to medieval winter, where survival wasn't about thriving, but about outlasting the season like a contestant on the world's most depressing game show. The good news? You're not invaded by Vikings today. The bad news? You still have to milk a frozen cow. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. For medieval farmers, winter wasn't a quaint postcard scene with frosted cottages and jingling sleigh bells. It was a months-long siege where the enemy was nature itself. Forget cocoa by the fire. Cocoa wasn't even known in Europe yet, and fire was mostly just smoke that clung to your clothes for eternity. Winters in northern Europe stretched from November to March, and for those living in the countryside, every day was a question of, did I store enough to not starve, and will my toes still be attached by spring? It's easy to imagine today's complaints: bad Wi-Fi, soggy socks, a lukewarm latte, and laugh. But in the 14th century, people's worries were far more primal: food, heat, health. 3 constant battles fought with tools about as sophisticated as a wooden spoon, a smoky hearth, and hope. Winter was the medieval equalizer. Rich lords might have better fires and furs, but even they couldn't stop drafty stone castles from feeling like glorified refrigerators. The peasantry, however, had it worse. Their homes were basically glorified sheds, timber frames packed with mud and straw, one smoky hearth in the middle, and insulation provided by sheep standing next to you. Modern home heating makes 72 FF sound like a rite, but back then, if you woke up without frost forming on your blanket, you called it a win. And speaking of blankets, let's adjust expectations. Forget feather duvets. Blankets were scratchy wool, often damp, and occasionally doubled as tablecloths or cloaks during the day. Recycling wasn't trendy. It was necessary. Darkness was another enemy. With daylight lasting barely 8 hours, much of life revolved around the brief burst of light, and then enduring the endless black candles, when available, were a luxury. Most peasants relied on rushlights, strips of reed dipped in animal fat that sputtered out faster than your enthusiasm for New Year's resolutions. Imagine doing all your evening activities, cooking, sewing, praying, or simply finding the chamber pot by a flickering flame that smelled like roasted sheep. Romantic? Only if your idea of romance includes constant smoke inhalation. And without light, nights were long, cold, and eerie. The silence of the countryside was punctuated by creaking rafters, howling winds, and the occasional wolf. Fear was not just of hunger, but of what prowled outside in the dark. This was before electric fences, firearms, or even reliable doors. Wolves weren't a fairy tale. They were a very real threat. The physical challenges of medieval winters were brutal, but the psychological toll was equally exhausting. Modern people moan about seasonal depression. Medieval farmers would have called that Tuesday, with no entertainment but storytelling, prayer, and maybe a flute badly played by your cousin. You had to find joy in monotony. There were no Netflix binges, unless you count watching your neighbor cough for 3 hours straight. Community helped, of course. Families huddled together, not out of love but necessity. Warmth was communal, whether you liked it or not. Privacy was a luxury. Everyone slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed. So if your uncle snored like a dying ox, congratulations, you were now living in surround sound. If all this sounds bleak, it was, but humor existed even then, often as the only way to cope. Medieval people made jokes about the weather, mocked each other's shivering, and sang bawdy songs around the fire. Surviving winter meant not only stockpiling food but laughter. A chuckle at the expense of your misfortune was sometimes the difference between despair and determination. And, in a way, humor itself was a survival tactic. Because let's face it, when your cow refuses to give milk because her udders are frozen, laughter is the only medicine you can afford. This is the stage where our story begins. Endless cold, cramped houses, hunger always waiting in the wings, and days so short that time itself seemed to freeze. In the coming chapters we'll step deeper into the details, how food was stored, how animals doubled as heating systems, why clothing made you itch and not warm, and how festivals gave fleeting relief from monotony. But before we dig into those, remember this: medieval winters weren't something to get through, they were something to endure. So the next time you pull a blanket over yourself in your heated home, sipping your coffee, scrolling through your phone, congratulations, you've already outlived the daily misery of a medieval farmer. Just don't complain if your latte is cold. They'd gladly trade your lukewarm coffee for their block of frozen turnip soup. If you were a medieval farmer, your entire life wasn't measured in hours or minutes. It was measured in seasons. The church bells might tell you when to pray, but the fields told you when to work, and the looming spectre of winter told you whether you'd live to see another spring. Every task you did in the warmer months carried one clear message: do this now or freeze later. Procrastination wasn't just frowned upon, it was fatal. A missed core in July might mean an empty stomach in February, and nobody wanted to become the cautionary tale muttered about in the tavern. It all started with spring, that fragile time of year when the snow reluctantly retreated and the earth, still stiff and sulking, was finally coaxed back to life. Farmers rushed out with plows pulled by oxen, turning the soil for the first planting. Seeds had to go in quickly: wheat, barley, rye, because the clock was already ticking. Every day lost to laziness or rain was a day shaved off the eventual harvest, and no harvest meant no bread. Bread wasn't just a meal, it was existence. Without it, you didn't just diet, you died. Spring wasn't a gentle season, it was frantic. Livestock, thin and half-starved from the winter, needed to be revived and fattened again. Calves and lambs were born, sometimes inside smoky huts because the cold outside would kill them faster than a wolf. The farmer's year began with urgency, as if winter was already waiting just over his shoulder, sharpening its icy claws and grinning. Summer was no time for rest either. While the sun warmed the land, the workload multiplied. Fields had to be weeded, crops tended, and hay cut and dried. Hay might sound like a minor footnote in history, but to medieval farmers it was everything. Hay kept the animals alive when snow buried the fields. No hay meant no oxen to plow next spring, no cows to give milk, and no pigs fattened on scraps. And without animals, your chance of survival sank faster than your cousin Olaf after his fifth ale at the midsummer feast. Every task had a deadline, but unlike modern work, there were no reminders, no sticky notes, no Google calendars. Nature was the only manager, and it had no sympathy. Miss the window to cut hay before the rain, and it rotted in the field. Forget to gather kindling during summer, and you shivered in January. The medieval farmer lived by a silent mantra: winter will ask what you did in July. Then came autumn, the make-or-break season. If spring was planting hope and summer was anxious caretaking, autumn was judgment day. The harvest had to be gathered, stored and preserved with ruthless efficiency. Entire villages worked together to bring in grain, carting it to barns where it was threshed and winnowed. Grain wasn't just food, it was insurance. Pile it high enough and you had a chance of surviving. Miscalculate and you'd spend March gnawing on bark and regret. But grain alone wasn't enough. Autumn also meant gathering root vegetables, apples, nuts, and anything else that could be tucked away in pits, cellars, or jars. Meat was salted or smoked, a process that involved long days over smoldering fires until you smelled more like bacon than a human being. Every chore in autumn had a drumbeat of finality to it, because once the first snow fell, time was up. There were no second chances, no fresh shipments arriving from the next town. What you had was what you had, and what you didn't, Well, the graveyards weren't empty for long. This calendar of survival also shaped people's sense of community. You couldn't tackle everything alone. Neighbors often pitched in during harvests, knowing that one family's failure could lead to desperate theft, unrest, or worse, a weakened village. Even the church calendar reinforced the rhythm, tying holy days to planting, harvests, and feasts. God might forgive your sins, but he wouldn't forgive forgetting to sow rye before the frost. And while the rhythm of the seasons was exhausting, it also offered a strange kind of security. You always knew what was next. Spring brought plowing, summer brought hay, autumn brought harvest, and winter brought the reckoning. It wasn't about choice, it was about duty. There was no maybe I'll do it later. Later was starvation, plain and simple. The medieval farmer's life was a constant dialogue with the future. Every handful of seed, every sheaf of hay, every salted hunk of pork was a message sent months ahead. Dear February me, please don't die. And February wrote back, nice try, but you didn't cut enough firewood. The calendar wasn't just a tool for survival, it was a philosophy. Work wasn't work, it was an investment in existence. Rest wasn't leisure, it was a gamble you couldn't afford. Every day between April and October was lived with winter in mind, and that constant pressure shaped not only their daily lives but their entire worldview. Life was precarious, short, and at the mercy of forces they couldn't control, and winter was the annual reminder of just how powerless they were. As grim as that sounds, it also meant people valued the small victories. A barn stuffed with grain felt like winning the lottery. A successful hay harvest meant you could sleep without picturing your oxen keeling over mid-January. The medieval year was a seesaw of anxiety and relief, a never-ending to-do list, where every checked box meant another week of survival. And so the calendar of survival ticked on, year after year, generation after generation. Children were raised to know it, adults lived and breathed it, and the elderly, those few who made it, measured their wisdom by how many winters they'd cheated. Next, we'll step deeper into this grim routine by examining one of its riskiest bets, the Great Grain Gamble, where an entire village's life could hinge on whether the harvest gods felt generous or spiteful. If medieval life were a game, then grain was the jackpot, the currency, and the consolation prize all rolled into one. Forget gold, jewels, or even a nice pair of shoes. What you really wanted was sacks of wheat, rye, or barley, stacked high enough to last through the endless winter. Bread wasn't just a staple, it was the foundation of existence. In fact, bread was such a central figure in the medieval diet that without it, you weren't just hungry, you were practically nobody. As people at the time might have said if they had social media, no bread, no life. Here's the problem though, grain was fickle. It didn't care about your plans, your prayers, or your desperate hunger. Grain obeyed the weather, and medieval weather had a cruel sense of humor. Too much rain, and your fields rotted. Too little, and your seeds withered in the dust. Add a stray hailstorm or an outbreak of crop disease, and your year's supply of bread quickly turned into one very sad pile of mold. Every harvest was a gamble, and more often than not, the house by which we mean nature won. Let's talk about wheat first, the queen of grains. Wheat made the finest, fluffiest bread, the kind that lords demanded at their tables. But wheat was a diva. It wanted the best soil, the right amount of sunshine, and no drama. If you were a peasant, you couldn't count on wheat to save you because most of it ended up in the granaries of your landlord anyway. You might plant it, you might harvest it, but the chances of you actually eating it were slim. It was like farming for someone else's dinner party while you made do with the crumbs. Rye, on the other hand, was the workhorse, tough, hardy, and willing to grow where wheat threw a tantrum. Rye was the peasant's friend. It gave you a dark, dense bread that could double as a doorstop. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept you alive. The downside, rye sometimes carried a little hitchhiker, a fungus called ergot. Eat too much of that and you didn't just get a stomachache, you got convulsions, hallucinations, and the delightful sensation of your limbs turning black and falling off. Historians have even linked outbreaks of ergot poisoning to waves of hysteria and witch trials. Imagine blaming your neighbor for cursing your cow when really it was just your sandwich trying to kill you. Then there was barley, the middle child of medieval grains. Barley wasn't fancy enough for fine bread and wasn't tough enough to feed everyone alone, but it had one huge advantage. It made beer. And in a world where water could make you sick, beer was basically life insurance in a tankard. Barley bread might have been coarse and chewy, but at least when you ground it up, brewed it and left it bubbling for a while, you got something liquid that kept both thirst and germs at bay. You might stumble around a bit more, but at least you weren't dead. Harvest time was both a celebration and a frenzy. Villages turned out in force, scythes swinging in the fields, bundles tied up and hauled off to be threshed. The rhythm of the sickles, the shouting of neighbors, and the creak of carts formed a kind of chaotic symphony that decided your future. The grain had to be gathered fast, because storms or thieves could ruin it all in a single night. And yes, thieves were a real problem. Hungry peasants sometimes helped themselves to a neighbor's grain, which led to squabbles, brawls, and occasionally murder over something as simple as a sack of barley. Forget jewels heists. The medieval world's great theft was always bread-related. Once harvested, the gamble wasn't over. You had to store the grain. Barns, granaries, and even clay pots in the ground were used. But mice, rats, and dampness were always ready to turn your carefully hoarded treasure into compost. If your grain spoilt, there was no emergency grocery run. There was just hunger and regret, and maybe watching your neighbor eat smugly while you chewed on boiled weeds. Because bread was so vital, it became woven into the very culture of the time. Oaths were sworn on bread, deals were sealed over bread, and even language reflected its importance. The word lord comes from hlafweird, meaning loaf guardian. Essentially, your local noble was supposed to be the keeper of the bread. Did he always do his job? Not unless he was unusually generous. For most peasants, the reality was that the lord guarded his loaf while you gnawed on crusts. Bread was also a marker of status. The wealthy ate white bread made from sifted wheat flour, soft and light. The poor made do with dark bread from rye, barley, or whatever mix of grains and beans they could scrape together. If you sat down to a slice of fluffy wheat bread, it wasn't just lunch, it was a declaration that you weren't one of the starving masses. For peasants, bread was both life and humiliation. It kept you alive but constantly reminded you of your place. So every year the cycle repeated. Seeds went in the ground, prayers went up to heaven, and farmers crossed their fingers that this time maybe, just maybe, the harvest would be enough. Most of the time it wasn't. Grain stores ran thin by late winter, rations grew smaller, and meals became sadder. Bread stopped being a loaf and turned into scraps stretched with beans, peas, or even sawdust in desperate times. Survival depended on how well you'd played the great grain gamble, and most years the dice came up cruel. What all of this meant was that bread wasn't just food, it was personality, identity, and destiny rolled into one. Eat well, and you lived. Fail the gamble, and winter buried you alongside last year's unlucky gamblers. Grain was both savior and tormentor, and the medieval farmer's life revolved around appeasing it. Next, we'll descend into another desperate attempt to outwit winter. The art of preserving food without anything resembling a refrigerator. Spoiler alert, salt, smoke, and an endless tolerance for everything tasting like jerky. If there's one thing medieval farmers knew all too well, it was this. Food doesn't politely wait around for you to eat it. Grain sprouted mold, meat rotted, milk soured, and fish stank faster than a tavern after a feast. With no refrigerators, no freezers, and no hope of best before labels, survival hinged on learning how to trick food into not turning against you. Preserving food wasn't a luxury, it was a desperate daily science experiment where the prize was survival and the penalty was a very smelly death. The star of this grim kitchen magic was salt. Salt was basically medieval Tupperware, except worth more than your life. Wars were fought over salt, entire trade routes were carved to move it, and if you lived far from a source, you could expect to pay through the nose for a few precious handfuls. Salt didn't just season your dinner, it stood between you and famine. rub enough of it into meat, and suddenly that pig you slaughtered in October could still be edible in March. Edible, of course, being a generous term. By spring, salted meat had the texture of a brick and the taste of licking a rock. Still, when the alternative was starving, medieval jaws learned to chew like champions. Smoking was the second great weapon in the fight against rot. No, not the relaxing kind that comes with cigars and melancholy poetry. This was the hang your fish in a cloud of wood smoke until it tastes like a campfire variety. Families built smokehouses or simply dangled strips of meat and fish over smouldering fires for days, sometimes weeks. The process infused everything with an aroma so powerful that even wolves probably turned up their noses. But smoky bacon or fish could last months, and that was worth the trade-off of your entire house smelling like a bonfire forever. Imagine waking up, sneezing soot, and then sitting down to yet another plate of what could only be described as chewy smoke on a stick. Drying was another trusty trick, particularly for fruit, herbs, and smaller cuts of meat. Sunlight in summer was harnessed to shrivel apples into something resembling modern trail mix, or more accurately, wrinkled lumps that tested both your teeth and your patience. Beans and peas were left to dry until they rattled like maracas, stored in sacks, and then resurrected in winter potages. It was practical, yes, but no one was winning culinary awards. Eating a dried apple in February was less yum, sweet snack and more, oh good, something that won't kill me immediately. Then there was pickling. If you had barrels, vinegar, and enough imagination, you could dunk vegetables in brine and hope for the best. Pickled cabbage, onions, and turnips were common, though taste testers probably cried a little inside with every bite. It wasn't about delighting your palate, it was about not collapsing from scurvy halfway through Lent. Brine-soaked anything was better than nothing, even if it made your dinner taste like a chemistry experiment gone wrong. Cheese and butter offered another preservation strategy. Fresh milk spoiled almost instantly, but turn it into cheese, and suddenly you had something that lasted weeks or even months. Hard cheeses could outlast a siege. Butter, heavily salted, survived far longer than milk, though by February it might have been saltier than the words you muttered while eating it. Cheese, however, was a triumph, a way of bottling the richness of summer pastures and unlocking it in the middle of winter gloom. Of course, if you were poor, you probably ate the cheap soft stuff quickly, while the good hard wheels marched straight to the Lord's pantry. Fish preservation was its own mini-industry. Coastal villages dried, salted and barreled herring, cod, and other catch, shipping them inland where peasants depended on them for protein, especially during the endless no-meat fasting days enforced by the church. A barrel of salt herring was both a blessing and a curse. Blessing because it kept you alive, curse because by February you were ready to swear eternal enmity against fish. Preserving wasn't just about food, it was about logistics. Barrels, sacks, smokehouses and cellars were as important as fields and plows. A farmer could work all year to raise a pig, only to see the effort wasted if he lacked the salt to cure it, or a dry place to hang it. Rodents, mold and moisture were constant saboteurs. It was said a good rat could eat more of your food than your child ever would, and unlike your child, you couldn't tell it to go outside and play. And so food preservation became almost ritualistic, part of the annual cycle. Autumn was slaughter season, when families butchered animals and immediately began the laborious work of salting, smoking, and drying. The air filled with the smell of fires and blood, a grim reminder that everything was on a deadline. If you didn't get it done before the frost, your family didn't get through winter. There was no shortcut, no freezer to fall back on, no emergency delivery from the next town. What you preserved was what you had, and don't imagine that these preserved foods were enjoyable. By late winter, after months of gnawing salted pork and drinking weak beer, even a shriveled onion could feel like a delicacy. Variety was a distant dream. Survival was the only recipe. Preservation methods kept bodies alive, but they also turned dinner into a parade of monotonous, salty, smoky, sour meals that made you wonder if starvation might be less offensive to the taste buds. Yet, as miserable as it sounds, it worked. Salt, smoke, brine, and sun kept villages alive when winter closed its icy fist. Without these preservation methods, entire communities would have vanished. Every slab of salted meat, every dried apple, every barrel of herring was not just food. It was hope made edible. Next, we'll descend underground into the earthy, rat-infested world of root cellars, where turnips, carrots, and parsnips lived out their winter in chilly storage pits, waiting to save you from starvation with all the culinary glamour of damp wood. If meat could be smoked and salted into submission, vegetables demanded a different form of imprisonment: burial. Enter the root cellar, the medieval solution to keeping turnips, carrots, and parsnips alive long enough to rescue you from starving sometime around February. Think of it as the original walk-in fridge, except there was no electricity, no shelves, no pleasant hum, just a dark hole in the ground where your food sat waiting, guarded by rats, dampness, and the faint hope that it wouldn't all rot before you needed it. At its core, the idea was simple: bury the vegetables somewhere cool, dark, and stable so that they wouldn't sprout, freeze, or decay too quickly. The earth itself became the farmer's ally, providing insulation against frost and an even temperature that medieval houses, with their smoke-filled chaos, could never offer. A good cellar kept the cold out and the moisture in, just enough to keep those root vegetables firm and edible. A bad cellar, on the other hand, was basically a compost heap with extra steps. Construction methods varied depending on where you lived. Some families dug simple pits in the ground, lined with straw, and covered them with wooden planks or sod. Others, a little wealthier, had dedicated underground chambers built from stone or clay, complete with narrow entrances that could be sealed up against the winter air. In either case, the result was the same. You lowered your food into its chilly dungeon and prayed you wouldn't find it slimy when you came back in February. The vegetables themselves weren't glamorous. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets were the main players, rugged, earthy foods that grew in bulk and didn't mind being ignored for months on end. Potatoes hadn't yet arrived in Europe, so forget the fantasy of endless mashed spuds. Instead, the medieval diet leaned heavily on the turnip, a vegetable that seemed specifically designed to test the limits of human tolerance. Carrots, less sweet than the orange ones we know today, were often purple, white, or yellow. Parsnips provided a touch of sweetness, though by March they were as wrinkled as the old man down the lane who swore he'd seen 3 winters worse than this one. Storage wasn't foolproof. Rats and mice were the first to arrive, treating your carefully hoarded produce like their personal buffet. Digging into your cellar to find gnawed roots and tiny paw prints was a misery unique to peasant life. To combat this, families sometimes placed cats near the entrance or set crude traps, but rodents are nothing if not persistent. The joke was that you didn't so much own a root cellar as share it with 1,000 furry roommates. Then there was the problem of rot. A single spoiled carrot could turn a pile of stored vegetables into a mushy disaster. People quickly learned the rule of thumb: 1 rotten root, and you'll be eating grief. Careful packing in layers of straw or sand helped slow decay, but nothing guaranteed success. The smell of a failing root cellar was unforgettable, a sour, earthy stench that clung to the back of your throat and made you wish you'd been born into a family that could afford wheat bread instead of turnip stew. Accessing the cellar wasn't always pleasant either. Imagine trudging through knee-deep snow, lifting a frozen plank, and climbing down into a dark hole with only a rushlight to guide you. Your breath fogs the air, your fingers go numb, and all of this effort rewards you with a parsnip. Survival wasn't glorious. It was often anticlimactic. Despite its grim nature, the root cellar represented hope in the bleakest months. Each vegetable stored there was a ticket to one more meal, one more day alive. In midwinter, when salted meat felt like a punishment and stale bread could chip a tooth, pulling out a firm carrot was cause for real joy. Stews and pottages grew slightly less monotonous when thickened with earthy roots. Even if the flavor was muddy with a hint of straw, it broke the monotony of salted pork and pickled cabbage. Interestingly, the cellar was also a place of superstition. People believed that certain rituals, placing garlic among the roots, burying a coin with the harvest, or whispering blessings, could keep spoilage at bay. Whether or not it worked is questionable, But when your survival depended on a pile of vegetables underground, you didn't take chances. Faith, like straw, was just another layer of protection. Root cellars also had a social element. Some villages pooled resources into communal pits, where each family stored part of their harvest. This reduced the risk of total loss if your pit collapsed or spoiled. You might still beg or barter from the communal stash. Of course, it also bred suspicion. If your neighbor came back from the communal cellar with a suspiciously heavy basket, you could bet whispers of theft would ripple through the village by morning. By late winter, the cellar became both treasure chest and torture chamber. Treasure, because there were still roots left to eat. Torture, because those roots were shriveled, tasteless, and often sprouting. You knew spring was close when the carrots began to look more like green-haired goblins than food. Eating them required imagination, patience, and sometimes closing your eyes. Still, as miserable as it sounds, the root cellar was a lifesaver. It was the difference between a family that trudged into spring weak but alive, and one that never made it out of February. Vegetables might not have been glamorous, but they were loyal companions in the war against hunger. Without their underground exile, medieval winters would have claimed far more lives. Next, we'll head back above ground to examine a much stranger survival tactic, inviting your livestock inside the house. Because nothing says cozy winter like sharing your bedchamber with a goat and 3 chickens. If you think your roommate leaves dirty socks lying around, just wait until you meet the medieval alternative, a full-sized cow. When winter howled outside and frost turned your breath into clouds, medieval families did what seemed both practical and horrifying. They brought their animals inside: pigs, chickens, goats, sheep, and yes, sometimes even the family cow shuffled into the living space, making your one-room hut look less like a home and more like a petting zoo with hygiene issues. Your bedmate wasn't your spouse, it was the family cow, and she didn't exactly believe in personal space. The logic behind this bizarre arrangement was actually simple. Animals generated heat. Every living creature is in essence a small furnace. A cow could radiate more warmth than a smoky fire in the hearth, and if you happened to be sleeping within mooing distance, you might actually survive the night without frostbite. Chickens, when tucked in baskets or perches, weren't just egg layers, they were feathery little radiators. Even pigs, though famously messy, gave off enough heat that their presence was worth tolerating. Who needed central heating when you had central mooing? Of course, practicality didn't erase the chaos. Imagine lying down on your straw mattress, trying to drift off while a goat sneezes in the corner, a pig snuffles loudly under the table, and chickens decide that 3 a.m. is the perfect time for a squabble. Medieval lullabies weren't just mothers humming. They were the combined soundtrack of barnyard bedfellows, and heaven help you if one of them decided to relieve themselves indoors. Spoiler, they always did. The floor was usually dirt anyway, which meant winter nights doubled as both bedtime and barn cleaning shift. This arrangement blurred the line between domestic life and farm life. The single-room houses of peasants often had no real separation between human space and animal space. One half might be reserved for cooking and sleeping, while the other half was partitioned, sometimes by nothing more than a wooden rail for livestock. Wealthier peasants might have separate stalls or lean-tos built onto their homes, but for the average family, the goat was just as much a housemate as grandma. There was also an element of security to this practice. In the dead of winter, predators like wolves prowled villages, and thieves sometimes snatched livestock. Keeping animals indoors wasn't just about warmth, it was about guarding your most precious assets. Losing a cow wasn't just losing a pet, it was losing milk, labor, and next year's calf. If that cow could sleep 3 feet from your children, you knew she was safe, and if the smell made you gag, well, at least you were gagging together. And speaking of smell, yes, it was horrific. Pigs aren't known for their delicate perfume, and cows produced more than milk. Imagine the blend: animal droppings, smoke from the hearth, damp wool clothes, and the occasional whiff of salted fish from dinner. It was less home sweet home and more olfactory torture chamber. People became nose-blind to it over time, but any traveler passing through must have wondered how humans and livestock coexisted without simply keeling over. Yet, amid the chaos, there were small benefits. Children grew up knowing animals intimately, not just as food sources but as companions. A child's core might be feeding chickens right beside the hearth or scratching a sheep's back while fetching kindling. To them it was normal. The family dog wasn't special. It was just one more creature sharing floor space with the pig. Modern people pay for petting zoos. Medieval peasants lived in one full-time. And yes, sometimes bonds formed. That cow wasn't just warmth. She had a name, a personality, and probably a grumpy habit of swatting you with her tail at inopportune moments. Chickens became characters in household life, with gossip exchanged about which one laid well and which one was lazy. Pigs might be fattened for slaughter, but until then they were part of the family. It was both practical and oddly sentimental. When slaughter day came, tears sometimes accompanied the butchering knife, though hunger always overruled sentiment. Not every animal was welcome indoors, of course. Horses usually stayed outside in stables, since their size and hooves would have turned a one-room hut into rubble. But for smaller stock, the indoor arrangement was widespread across Europe. Archaeological digs of medieval homes often reveal signs, chewed beams, compacted earth floors, and yes, layers of ancient manure that tell us livestock really did bunk alongside their human caretakers. The practice also left its mark on folklore and sayings. Animals weren't just background, they shaped the rhythm of daily life. Proverbs compared human behavior to pigs in the house or hens squabbling on the hearth. Children's stories often featured farm animals as central characters, because those were the faces children literally grew up with, snoring inches from their straw mattresses. By spring, when the thaw came, both humans and animals were more than ready to part ways. Families shoveled out the filth, drove their cows back to pasture, and took a deep breath of fresh air for the first time in months. But during the long nights of January, the choice was simple: share your bed with a goat or risk freezing beside an empty fire. Survival made strange roommates, and medieval farmers learned that warmth trumped dignity every time. Next, we'll shift from living, breathing heaters to the smoky and suffocating hearth itself, exploring how medieval homes battled the cold with fires that warmed you just as effectively as they slowly choked you. If there was one thing medieval farmers wanted almost as much as bread, it was warmth. Unfortunately, their heating systems were about as sophisticated as striking two rocks together and hoping not to set your tunic on fire. The open hearth was the beating heart of the medieval home, but it was also its smoky, choking, lung-blackening nemesis. The good news? You're warm. The bad news? You now cough like a 90-year-old sailor who's been chain-smoking since the Crusades. Picture a one-room peasant hut, dirt floor, timber frame, thatch roof, and right in the middle, a fire pit. No chimney, no fancy flue, just flames licking upward and smoke filling every available inch of space. The smoke was supposed to escape through a hole in the roof, but more often it clung to the rafters, seeped into your woolen clothes, and turned your lungs into experimental storage units. Modern people worry about second-hand smoke from a single cigarette. Medieval families inhaled the equivalent of a forest fire every night, just by existing indoors, and yet, without that fire, life would have been impossible. The hearth was more than just heat. It was where meals were cooked, water was boiled, and sometimes tools or clothes were dried. It was the household Swiss Army knife, except it made everything smell like a bonfire. If you wanted to warm your hands, you crouched by it. If you wanted to thaw your boots, you risked burning them. If you wanted to breathe fresh air, well, too bad. The hearth gave and the hearth took away. Not every family burned the same fuel. In forested areas, wood was the go-to, though by the late Middle Ages, firewood was expensive and increasingly scarce. Poorer households often turned to peat blocks of dried swamp muck cut, stacked, and left to harden into something flammable. Peat fires smoked heavily, filled the room with an earthy stench, and left your skin as brown as the walls. But at least they burned. In some regions, dried dung was pressed into service as fuel. Imagine explaining that to your children. Yes, son, Tonight's warmth comes courtesy of the cow's backside. Then there was the heat itself, or the lack thereof. Hearth fires didn't exactly distribute warmth evenly. If you sat close, your face roasted while your back froze. If you sat too far, you might as well be outside with the chickens. Families learned to rotate positions like rotisserie chickens themselves, slowly turning in front of the flames to avoid frostbite on one side and burns on the other. A medieval winter evening was less cozy relaxation and more endurance training. Chimneys did exist in wealthier homes, especially castles and manor houses, but even there they were temperamental. Drafts sucked heat away. Sparks shot out like medieval fireworks, and chimneys had a nasty habit of catching the roof on fire. For peasants, chimneys were rare luxuries. Smoke clung to rafters until it oozed out through the thatch, blackening everything and leaving the interior permanently perfumed with eau ashtray. Generations of soot coated beams so thickly that they were practically fireproof, though ironically the house around them wasn't. Another quirk of open hearth heating was how it doubled as pest control. Fleas and lice, those eternal companions of medieval life, hated smoke. Families sometimes deliberately allowed their houses to fill with eye-watering clouds just to drive the little critters out. So yes, you couldn't breathe and your eyes burned, but at least you weren't itchy. That counted as a win. The hearth also dictated social life. Evenings were spent huddled around it, not because of affection, but because frostbite was waiting in the corners. Stories, songs, prayers, and gossip all unfolded in a circle around the firelight. It was both a physical and cultural center. When someone said hearth and home, they meant it literally. Without that pile of burning sticks, you had neither. But don't be fooled into thinking it was all warmth and cheer. Fires consumed fuel at a terrifying rate. A family might spend entire days in summer gathering wood or cutting peat, simply to keep a hearth burning through winter. Run out in January, and you faced a choice: shiver to death or start chopping down furniture. Desperation stories abound of peasants burning wagon wheels, wooden tools, or anything else that would catch. Even wooden beams weren't entirely safe if winter dragged on too long. Nothing makes you question your life choices quite like debating whether to freeze slowly or dismantle your own roof beam for kindling. Add to this the ever-present fire hazard. With a thatched roof overhead and straw underfoot, sparks were basically medieval hand grenades. One stray ember and your entire livelihood went up in smoke, literally. Fires were communal disasters, and whole villages sometimes vanished in one night. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very thing that kept you alive could also kill you in spectacular fashion. Still, people adapted. They mastered balancing pots on iron tripods, learned to judge the right thickness of peat for steady heat, and developed a tolerance for smoke that would horrify a modern doctor. For all its flaws, the hearth kept families alive in a climate that wanted them dead. Without that smoky, suffocating, soot-stained blaze, the long medieval winter would have been unendurable. Next, we'll turn from the smoky hearth to what people actually wore while sitting beside it. Layers of wool, furs, and itchy linen that were supposed to keep the cold out, but mostly just made you look like a disgruntled sheep. When medieval farmers faced the bitter sting of winter, their first line of defense wasn't a roaring hearth or a hearty stew. It was clothing. Except clothing in this case meant piling on so many itchy layers of wool that you ended up looking like a disgruntled sheep impersonator. Forget sleek ski jackets or thermal underwear. Medieval winter fashion was an exercise in endurance. Laundry day meant chiseling ice off your underwear, and that was on a good week. The foundation of most winter wardrobes was linen. Linen undershirts and shifts were worn closest to the skin, not because they were particularly warm, but because they were easier to wash than wool. Easier here is relative, of course. Washing linen in icy water with lye soap that stripped both dirt and your dignity wasn't exactly fun. Still, linen acted as a barrier between your sweat and the expensive wool outer garments. Peasants might have owned only 1 or 2 linen pieces, worn until they could walk to the laundry line on their own. On top of linen came the wool. Wool was the superstar of medieval winter. It was warm even when damp. It could be woven into everything from socks to cloaks, and it was abundant in a world where sheep were as common as mud puddles. But wool also had its quirks. Untreated, it was itchy enough to make you wonder if frostbite might actually be the more comfortable option. Dyes were expensive, so most peasants walked around in shades of mud brown, sheep grey, or faded from too many harvests beige. High fashion it was not. Furs were the next layer up if you could afford them or trap them. Rabbit, fox and squirrel furs were common among peasants, while wealthier folks flaunted ermine or beaver. A fur-lined cloak could mean the difference between life and a very chilly death, though furs carried their own inconveniences. For one, they smelled. Unless carefully treated, fur retained the musky scent of its former owner, meaning you essentially walked around smelling like a wet animal. But at least you were alive, and that was the whole point. Head coverings were non-negotiable. Heat escaped through the head, so hoods, quiffs, and caps were ubiquitous. A medieval farmer might sleep in his hat, wake in his hat, and go to church in his hat, not because of style, but because removing it meant frostbite nibbling at your ears. Gloves and mittens were rarer since they interfered with work, but people improvised with wool wrappings or stuffed bits of straw inside their sleeves. If it kept the cold out, fashion points didn't matter. Footwear was a constant battle. Leather shoes or boots were common, but leather soaked through in snow and mud. To cope, farmers stuffed shoes with straw or moss for insulation. Imagine walking to church with your feet rustling like a scarecrow. It wasn't elegant, but it was practical. Socks, if you were lucky enough to own them, were knitted wool tubes that sagged around your ankles like limp sausages. Poorer folk often went without, their feet raw, cracked, and perpetually numb. Now imagine the logistics of layering all this. Getting dressed in the morning was less slip on a shirt and more assemble the armor of survival. Linen undershirt, wool tunic, maybe another wool tunic, a cloak, some furs, a hat, and boots stuffed with straw. You were less human and more bundle. Movement became an art form. Want to bend down to pick up a bucket? Good luck. You might hear the seams groan in protest. Need to run from a wolf? Hopefully the wolf tripped over your cloak before you did. And then there was laundry. Winter laundry was the medieval equivalent of a punishment from the gods. Clothes were washed in freezing streams or tubs filled with icy water. Soap was harsh, lye-based, and had a habit of eating skin as well as dirt. Garments froze stiff on the line, turning into cloth sculptures that flapped ominously in the wind. Pulling on a freshly laundered pair of linen undergarments was like donning armor made of icicles. One could only hope your body heat would thaw them before you lost circulation. Clothing also told a story about class. Nobles paraded in layered finery, velvets, silks, richly dyed wools. Peasants, meanwhile, looked like identical bundles of greyish wool trudging through the snow. The wealthy could afford fur-lined boots and multiple cloaks, while the poor often shared garments within families. If your tunic wore out, you patched it. When it wore out again, you patched the patch. Eventually, you ended up wearing something that looked less like clothing and more like a quilt of failures held together by stubbornness. Despite the misery, people still found ways to inject personality. Women might embroider hems with simple patterns. Men might add colorful belts or hoods if they could afford dye, and children often wore hand-me-downs so oversized they looked like miniature scarecrows. Practicality ruled, but a splash of individuality helped keep spirits alive in a world where every day was cold and grey. Ultimately, medieval winter clothing wasn't about fashion, it was about survival. The goal wasn't to look good but to outlast the snowdrifts, wind and damp that conspired to kill you. Every layer was a reminder that life was fragile and winter unforgiving. Yes, you itched. Yes, you smelled like wet sheep. Yes, your underwear occasionally froze solid. But when survival is the only runway show that matters, you strut in whatever you can. Next, we'll peel back those itchy layers and look at what really filled a farmer's belly during the frozen months. Thin gruel, stale bread, and the kind of meals that tested your patience almost as much as your digestive system. If you've ever stared into your fridge and thought, "There's nothing to eat," you'd better sit down before we discuss the medieval winter diet, because back then, nothing to eat didn't mean no leftover pizza. or only oat milk instead of regular. It meant watery pottage, stale bread, and whatever you could fish out of the root cellar that hadn't been gnawed on by rats. Breakfast didn't energize you. It just reminded you that you were still alive. The star of the winter dining table was pottage, that eternal, shapeless stew that had the consistency of swamp water and the nutritional excitement of wet cardboard. Pottage was basically whatever you could throw in a pot: grains, beans, roots, herbs, and the occasional scrap of meat if fortune smiled on you. It simmered for hours, sometimes days, with new ingredients dumped in whenever available. It wasn't so much a recipe as a lifestyle. Imagine eating the same murky bowl every day for months, spooning hope into your mouth alongside a chunk of suspiciously grey turnip. That was survival cuisine. Bread, too, was unavoidable. By winter, loaves baked after harvest had hardened into bricks. Fresh bread was rare. Most peasants gnawed on stale hunks dipped in pottage to soften them. Without that trick, eating bread was less about nourishment and more about dental warfare. Rye bread, especially, had the density of a paving stone. A bad winter might mean stretching the flour by mixing in peas, beans, or even ground-up tree bark. If you ever wanted to know what desperation tasted like, it was bark bread filling your belly with sawdust and regret. Protein sources were meager. Meat was scarce, especially after the slaughter season in autumn was long past. By February, most families had little more than scraps of salted pork or the odd bit of preserved fish to throw into the pot. Eggs were fewer too. Chickens didn't lay well in the cold and dark. Milk was limited because cows often gave less in winter, and what you did get went straight into making butter or cheese that could last longer. So most meals relied heavily on plants: beans, peas, onions, cabbage, anything that could be stored, dried, or dug up from underground. Spices? Forget it, unless you were rich enough to shop on trade routes that stretched to India. For peasants, seasoning was salt if you were lucky, or maybe a handful of leeks or herbs. Salt, as we've seen, was precious. Using it to flavor food felt like burning money for fun. For most people, flavor in winter meant smoky from the hearth, sour from fermentation, or just plain bland. Your tongue wasn't pampered, it was punished. Alcohol, however, kept spirits alive. Ale and weak beer were staples, brewed from barley and grains that couldn't be stored indefinitely. Water was often unsafe, so beer was considered the healthier option, even for children. Don't picture frothy golden lagers. It was cloudy, sour, and often flat. Still, it was liquid calories, and it dulled the edges of another monotonous dinner. If you were very unlucky, you drank thin gruel for breakfast, stale bread for lunch, and then, surprise, more gruel for supper, washed down with beer that tasted like someone had sneezed in it. Feasts occasionally broke up the monotony, usually tied to the church calendar. Christmas or Epiphany might mean meat pies, roasted fowl, or honey cakes, but those were rare highlights, not everyday reality. After the feast came the fasts, long stretches when the church forbade meat altogether, leaving peasants to stare glumly at their fish barrels and wonder how many more weeks until Lent ended. Hunger itself was a constant shadow. By late winter, rations shrank, meals got thinner, bowls smaller, and stomachs louder. Families stretched what little they had with more water, more root vegetables, more anything. Children especially suffered, their growing bodies gnawed by hunger, even as they chewed the same turnip stew night after night. Malnutrition wasn't some distant possibility, it was Tuesday. And yet, humor lingered even at the dinner table. People joked about their food's lack of variety, mocked stale bread that could break a tooth, and made light of chewing endlessly on the same cabbage leaf until it felt like an old friend. Survival demanded laughter, even when your supper could double as mortar for patching the house. The medieval winter diet was monotonous, joyless, and sometimes barely edible, but it was survival. Every stale crust, every bowl of pottage, every sour gulp of ale carried people one day closer to spring, and for peasants that was all that mattered. Food wasn't about pleasure, it was about endurance. Next, we'll wash it all down by exploring the one thing everyone drank whether they liked it or not: ale and weak beer. the liquid bread that kept medieval farmers hydrated, tipsy, and occasionally face first in the snow. If you've ever woken up dehydrated and reached for a glass of water, congratulations, you already live a life of unimaginable medieval luxury. For the farmers of the Middle Ages, water was not to be trusted. Rivers doubled as trash heaps, animal baths, and open sewers, and wells weren't always safe either. Drink the wrong cup and you'd end up in the local churchyard faster than you could say bottoms up. The solution? Ale and weak beer. In fact, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was the medieval hydration plan, tipsy by noon, hungover by bedtime. Ale was essentially liquid bread, made from barley or oats, brewed in massive vats, and consumed by everyone from toddlers to grandparents. It provided calories, some nutrients, and most importantly, a lower risk of immediate death than untreated water. Weak beer, also called small beer, was the version for everyday drinking. With a low alcohol content, it kept you hydrated without turning every chore into a slapstick accident. Stronger ales, meanwhile, were saved for feasts, celebrations, or the kind of long winter evenings when you needed help forgetting that dinner was once again cabbage stew. Brewing wasn't just a professional craft, it was a household necessity. Most peasant women brewed ale at home, juggling brewing alongside spinning wool, tending animals, and raising children. The process was laborious. Barley was malted by soaking and drying, then mashed and boiled, mixed with herbs or hops depending on the period and region, and finally left to ferment in wooden tubs. The result was cloudy, thick, and often sour. Forget crystal-clear golden lagers. Medieval ale looked like someone had scooped it straight from a mud puddle. But when survival is the bar, taste is negotiable. The brewing process itself was strangely democratic. While lords and monasteries brewed on a large scale, almost every household tried its hand at ale-making. Women known as alewives sold their surplus in villages, recognizable by the ale stakes, poles with garlands or cloths hanging outside their doors. It was one of the few ways women could earn money in a medieval community. Of course, alewives had to tread carefully. Brew too weak? And neighbors grumbled. Brew too strong and they accused you of witchcraft. Either way, people still showed up, mugs in hand, because thirst didn't care about gossip. The effects of this constant beer consumption were, unsurprisingly, visible. People weren't necessarily drunk all the time. Weak beer had just enough alcohol to kill bacteria without leaving you sloshed, but stronger brews often led to raucous nights. Tavern culture flourished even in small villages, where locals gathered to drink, argue, sing, and occasionally swing fists. Ale loosened tongues and tempers alike, making taverns both the social hubs and police blotters of their communities. Alcohol consumption was so routine that even children drank small beer. Imagine sending your 10-year-old out to the fields with a mug of brew sloshing around his hands. Today we'd call it irresponsible parenting. Back then it was Tuesday. And to be fair, small beer was often safer and more nutritious than the local water supply, offering a tiny bit of carbohydrate energy that might make the difference in surviving a long winter's day. Not all beer was equal, of course. The wealthy drank stronger, better quality brews, sometimes flavored with exotic spices or imported hops. The poor got what they could, thin, watery ale that was one step above gruel in liquid form. Monasteries, with their skilled brewers and access to resources, often produced the best beer, which is why many medieval travelers suddenly felt called to visit abbeys. Pilgrimage was thirsty work, after all. The downside of relying on beer for hydration, however, was that it carried consequences. Overindulgence was common, and winter evenings in particular saw plenty of staggering slurred speech and unfortunate accidents involving open hearths and ladders. The medieval hangover was likely brutal. No aspirin, no greasy bacon breakfast, just a pounding head while trudging through icy mud to feed the pigs. But hangovers didn't stop anyone from lifting the mug again the next day. Culturally, ale was more than a drink. It was a symbol of life itself. Deals were sealed over mugs, songs composed in its honor, and feasts measured by how many barrels were drained. Villages often judged the prosperity of a household by how much ale they could brew and serve, and when famine or plague struck, people often joked or lamented that at least they had beer to soften the misery. Despite the monotony of the medieval diet, ale added a small comfort. It provided warmth in the belly, distraction from hunger, and a sense of camaraderie. Sharing a jug of beer was sharing survival itself. If bread was body, ale was spirit, literally and figuratively. So while modern people sip bottled water without a second thought, medieval farmers raised their mugs, cloudy brew and all, and toasted to making it through another day. And though it left them tipsy by noon and bleary by morning, at least it kept them alive, something plain water couldn't always promise. Next, we'll leave the mugs behind and look at how farmers filled the long winter days when the fields lay frozen. Winter work, the endless cycle of mending, spinning and repairing that kept bodies busy even when the soil refused to cooperate. When the fields lay buried under snow and the plough sat idle, you might think medieval farmers finally got a chance to put their feet up and relax. Not so. Winter wasn't a holiday, it was medieval DIY season. Except you couldn't just quit and call a contractor when things went wrong. Instead, the long dark months became a different kind of busy, a season of fixing, mending and creating the tools and goods that kept life moving when spring returned. One of the main jobs was repairing tools. Ploughs, scythes, sickles and spades all took a beating during the spring planting and summer harvest. By December, iron blades were dull, wooden handles cracked, and entire contraptions looked one hard frost away from splintering into uselessness. Winter gave farmers time to sharpen blades on grindstones, rehaft axes with new handles, and patch together wagons with whatever wood hadn't already gone into the hearth. Every tool was precious. You couldn't just buy another at the village market. If your scythe snapped in July, your harvest was doomed. That meant January evenings bent over a whetstone were, in their own way, life insurance. Then there were roofs. Thatch, the humble golden lid of peasant homes, had a bad habit of leaking, sagging, or playing host to small wildlife. Winter was a time to climb up with bundles of straw and patch the holes before snow and rain turned your home into an indoor swamp. Imagine balancing on a slippery thatch roof in freezing winds while stuffing straw into gaps with numb fingers. It was less home improvement project and more seasonal survival obstacle course. Still, a patched roof meant you might sleep a little drier even if the smoke from the hearth still made your eyes water. Spinning wool was another winter occupation, especially for women. Summer shearing left piles of raw fleece that had to be carded, spun, and woven into yarn. The cold months were perfect for sitting near the fire with a spindle, twisting fibers into thread that would eventually become clothing, blankets, or sacks. This wasn't just busy work, it was the textile industry of the household. Without winter spinning, no one would have new tunics when the old ones wore through. Entire families might sit together in the flickering rushlight, the steady whir of spinning wheels and spindles filling the silence between coughing fits from the smoke. Men often turned to woodworking, carving tool handles, mending carts, fashioning stools, and even whittling small toys for children, kept hands busy when fields offered no labor. Some families produced wooden bowls, spoons, and utensils, not only for their own use, but to sell or barter. Winter might feel like an economic freeze, but a clever woodworker could still trade a set of spoons for a wedge of cheese or a jug of ale. Leatherwork also had its place in winter chores. Shoes needed constant patching, belts snapped, harnesses frayed. Farmers stretched, soaked, and stitched hides into something vaguely functional, though comfort was rarely achieved. A patched shoe with straw stuffed inside wasn't exactly elegant, but at least it kept your feet attached when you trudged through frozen mud. Children often wore hand-me-downs until their toes poked through, while fathers swore under their breath as they tried to stitch boots by dim firelight. Even the animals contributed to winter work. Farmers collected manure and spread it on frozen fields or piled it for spring use. It wasn't glamorous. Nothing says romantic winter pastime like shoveling steaming dung while snowflakes drift down, but it was necessary. Fertilizer meant crops, and crops meant not starving. Families that neglected this core often found themselves regretting it when spring planting rolled around and the soil refused to yield. Of course, winter work wasn't just physical. It was also planning. Farmers spent long nights mentally mapping their fields, deciding where to sow each crop, and calculating how much seed they had left after the previous year's gamble. It was medieval data analysis, minus spreadsheets and with more guesswork. Conversations often revolved around, if the barley fails, we'll try more rye, or we'll need to borrow oxen from the neighbor if ours don't survive. Plans weren't just theoretical. They were survival strategies hammered out over smoky suppers. And let's not forget domestic repairs. Doors sagged, shutters broke, walls needed reinforcing with mud and wattle. Winter turned homes into ongoing construction sites. A farmer might patch a hole in the wall during the day and then watch in despair as the wind howled through a new gap by nightfall. These repairs were constant, tedious, and rarely successful. But without them, homes would collapse under the weight of snow and neglect. Despite the grind, winter work carried its own rhythm. There was satisfaction in sharpening a blade, weaving a basket, or finishing a sturdy cloak. These tasks gave families a sense of purpose in months when the world outside seemed determined to freeze them into statues. And in a strange way, winter's labor provided balance. Summer demanded frantic outdoor toil. Winter demanded steady indoor persistence. Together they created a cycle of work that never truly let up, but at least shifted gears. So while the fields slept, farmers didn't. Winter was a workshop, a season of mending both tools and spirits. Every stitch, every sharpened edge, every patched roof tile was a small act of defiance against the cold. And though no one would ever call it restful, winter work was what kept the machinery of survival turning. Next, we'll look at the bleakest part of winter, when all that hard work still couldn't save you from the cruelest enemy of all, the hunger gap. That desperate stretch when supplies ran out and spring refused to hurry up. If the medieval winter was a battle, then late winter was the final siege, the point when the enemy had battered down the walls, your defenses were crumbling, and your last hope was a bucket of turnips that smelled suspiciously like feet. This dreadful stretch of the calendar was known as the hunger gap. By February or March, food stores were dwindling, supplies were thin, and the longed-for green shoots of spring crops were still weeks, if not months, away. Your diet plan wasn't keto. It was called starving artist, but without the art. The hunger gap was the cruel overlap between the exhaustion of winter stores and the stingy beginnings of the new agricultural cycle. Root vegetables buried in cellars had shriveled, grain bins rattled emptily, and salted meat barrels gave off the faint aroma of despair. Whatever was left to eat was unappetizing at best and downright hazardous at worst. That loaf of bread you hoarded in October, now it was so hard you could use it as a weapon. Those carrots, sprouting green hair and whispering that they'd rather be compost than dinner. And if you were desperate enough to cut into the last hunk of salt pork, you probably needed to scrape off an entire layer of salt and mold before gnawing into something that had all the charm of a leather boot. Meals became smaller, thinner, and more watery with each passing day. Pottage, already depressing in December, turned into little more than onion-flavored broth by March. Families stretched what they had with water, wild herbs, or even ground-up acorns, creating bowls of liquid sadness that barely qualified as food. Children went to bed hungry, bellies growling like angry watchdogs, while adults gave up their portions in a grim act of sacrifice. Hunger wasn't just a discomfort, it was a constant gnawing companion, reminding you with every rumble of your stomach that spring hadn't arrived yet. And let's be clear, people didn't just get hungry, they got weak. Malnutrition set in, sapping strength right when it was most needed. Farmers who should have been preparing fields were too exhausted to swing a hoe. Immune systems crumbled, making late winter the prime season for disease outbreaks. Colds turned into pneumonia, coughs turned into funerals, and neighbors whispered about which families might not make it through. The hunger gap didn't just empty stomachs, it emptied villages. To cope, people turned to foraging. Even in the snow, farmers combed woods and hedgerows for anything remotely edible. Nettles, sorrel, and other early greens were scavenged and thrown into pots, more medicine than meal. Mushrooms were gathered if you knew which ones wouldn't kill you, and if you didn't, well, your family found out quickly. Bark bread made another appearance, stretching flour with powdered tree bark until the result was half food, half sawdust. It filled the stomach, sure, but it also filled your soul with regret. Animals, too, faced starvation during the hunger gap. Hay supplies ran thin, fodder bins emptied, and farmers had to make brutal decisions. A cow might be slaughtered simply because feeding it was impossible, even though doing so robbed the household of future milk. Chickens laid fewer eggs, and those eggs became precious treasures rather than common breakfast fare. Dogs, often working animals, sometimes went hungry right alongside their masters, and in the darkest tales of the medieval hunger gap, rumors of cannibalism crept into chronicles, grim reminders of how desperate humans can become when survival is at stake. Social tensions often flared during this period. Hungry neighbors eyed each other's cellars with suspicion, theft increased, and communal bonds frayed. Villages that had once shared tools and labor now locked their doors and prayed no one came asking for food they didn't have. The church stepped in where it could, distributing alms or meals, but even generosity had its limits when supplies were gone across the board. It was a season that tested not just stomachs but souls, and yet people endured. Humor, once again, was a survival tool. Jokes were made about gnawing on old boots, or about how thin the stew was. I saw the bottom of the pot wave at me. Songs and stories became lighter, almost mocking the misery, because laughter made empty bowls slightly easier to bear. Even in starvation, people found ways to remind themselves that they were still human, not just stomachs with legs. The hunger gap also shaped the rhythm of medieval culture. Festivals and fasts were often timed around it, offering brief relief or distraction. By the time spring finally arrived, the relief was euphoric. The first green shoots weren't just food, they were salvation. Families rushed to harvest anything edible, sometimes pulling crops before they were fully grown just to silence their stomachs. The hunger gap ended not with a feast but with a tentative sigh of relief, as if the world had finally decided not to kill you this year. In truth, the hunger gap was a stark reminder that medieval life was a tightrope act. You could do everything right, plant diligently, harvest carefully, preserve wisely, and still end up staring into an empty pot while the snow lingered. It was the season that mocked preparation, humbled the proud and punished the careless. Surviving it didn't make you stronger, it just meant you were lucky enough to stagger into spring and do it all over again. Next, we'll step into another hazard of winter survival: illness and disease, because as if starving wasn't bad enough, late winter also liked to throw in a side dish of coughs, fevers, and the kind of medical advice that made bleeding seem like a cure-all. If hunger and cold weren't already enough to test the patience of a medieval farmer, winter had one more nasty surprise: sickness. Just when you thought you'd survived the endless nights, the smoky hearth, and the thrill of gnawing stale bread, winter leaned in and whispered, "How about a fever for dessert?" Colds, influenza-like plagues, fevers, and pneumonia swept through homes with the persistence of rats in a granary. And with no antibiotics, no vaccines, and barely any clue how germs worked, illness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was often fatal. The conditions were perfect for disease. Imagine families crammed into a single smoky room, sharing air with goats, chickens, and the occasional coughing cow. Fresh air was considered suspicious, so windows stayed sealed or didn't exist at all. The hearth coughed out smoke, the people coughed out mucus, and the cycle spun endlessly. It wasn't so much flu season as flu year-round, but especially winter when everyone was packed in like sardines. Colds and coughs might seem trivial now, but for medieval farmers, they were no joke. A sniffle could spiral into bronchitis, and bronchitis into pneumonia. Without proper treatment, lungs filled with fluid, fevers soared, and the unlucky patient quickly found themselves being measured for a grave. And medieval medicine, well, let's just say the cure was often worse than the disease. Doctors, if you could afford one, loved prescribing bloodletting. The logic went like this: if you were sick, you had too much bad blood, so the solution was obvious: drain some of it. Never mind that your patient was already weak and starving. Surely removing more of their life fluid would perk them right up. Spoiler, it didn't. If you couldn't afford a doctor, and most farmers couldn't, you relied on home remedies and superstition. Honey, garlic, vinegar, and herbs like sage or thyme were common treatments. And to be fair, some of them actually had mild antibacterial properties. But for every sensible herbal tea, there was also a poultice of mashed onions applied to your chest, or a charm whispered at midnight to drive away evil spirits. Illness was often explained as punishment from God, bad air, or malevolent forces. Germ theory was centuries away, so blaming your cough on your neighbor's curse seemed just as logical as blaming it on bacteria you couldn't see. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. A winter fever could sweep through a household and leave half the family gone by spring. Mortality was so common that parents sometimes didn't name children until they were a year old. Why get attached if little Tomlin wasn't going to make it past his first winter? It sounds harsh to modern ears, but when death hovered as close as the hearth, practicality often beat sentiment. Even when sickness wasn't fatal, it was still debilitating. Try tending goats or chopping firewood while shivering with a fever, or trudging through snow to fetch water with a hacking cough. Illness robbed families of their already limited labor force, making survival even harder. One sick farmer meant less firewood gathered, fewer repairs finished, and more pressure on already overworked family members. The domino effect could drag entire households into disaster, and then, of course, there were the big outbreaks. Influenza-like epidemics swept through medieval Europe periodically, devastating entire villages. Without understanding contagion, people packed into churches or markets, spreading disease like wildfire. If famine didn't get you, plague might. Winter wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a lottery where your ticket might read, "Congratulations, you've caught whatever killed half your neighbors." The church played a dual role in all this. Priests offered prayers, blessings, and holy water to ward off sickness, and monasteries sometimes provided rudimentary care. Monks grew medicinal herbs and experimented with balms and tinctures, preserving fragments of ancient medical knowledge. Still, their remedies were hit or miss. A tonic of rosemary and honey might soothe a cough, but chanting psalms over a fever rarely produced miraculous recoveries. Faith offered comfort, but not always cures. For the living, sickness also carried stigma. People whispered about curses, witchcraft, or divine punishment. If you fell ill, neighbors might avoid your house out of fear of contamination, or fear that your bad luck might rub off on them. In communities already strained by hunger and cold, illness became another wedge driving families into isolation. Yet amid the misery, people clung to resilience. They wrapped fevers in blankets, brewed steaming pots of herbs, whispered prayers, and carried on. Humor, as always, found its place. Jokes about coughing so hard you scared the chickens, or about bloodletting leaving you lighter than air, offered a moment of levity in households thick with worry. Survival wasn't just physical, it was mental. You had to laugh, or you'd weep. The grim truth was that winter illness wasn't just an extra burden. It was a reminder of how fragile life was. Every cough was a warning, every fever a gamble. Surviving wasn't guaranteed, no matter how many blankets you layered or how much garlic you chewed. For medieval farmers, the winter's extra gift was often a grave marker in frozen soil. Next, we'll leave the sickbed behind and look at how communities tried to pull together or sometimes pull apart during these brutal months, sharing what little they had or jealously guarding their last onion from the hungry eyes of neighbors. When winter stretched on like an unwanted guest who refused to leave, survival wasn't just about your own cellar or your own flock of chickens, it was also about your neighbors. In the medieval countryside, the community could be both your salvation and your downfall. On good days, people shared food, labor, and warmth. On bad days, they eyed each other's dwindling supplies like wolves circling the last sheep in the pen. Neighborly love meant sharing your last onion with Bob down the road, even if Bob's contribution to the village was mostly gossip and sneezing. Communal support wasn't some quaint bonus, it was essential. Villages operated on interdependence because no one household could weather the storms alone. If your roof collapsed under heavy snow, neighbors might pitch in with straw and manpower to patch it. If your ox dropped dead in January, you might borrow your neighbor's for spring plowing, assuming you hadn't annoyed him last autumn by accidentally grazing your goats on his strip of land. Everyone owed everyone favors, and in winter those favors were called in like debts from a very persistent landlord. The church also played a major role in this web of support. Almsgiving was not only a virtue but a duty, particularly in winter when the poor teetered on the edge of starvation. Wealthier villagers and lords were expected, sometimes shamed, into distributing bread, grain, or firewood to the needy. Parish priests organized collections, and monasteries provided simple meals of bread and broth for those who had nothing. This wasn't pure charity, it was also insurance. A starving population was a desperate population, and desperate people stole. Feeding the poor wasn't just saintly, it was good security policy. That said, generosity had limits. In a bad winter, when harvests had failed and the hunger gap yawned wide, even the most charitable households locked their doors at night. Stories abound of peasants caught stealing cabbages, onions, or a sack of grain, their punishments ranging from public shame to harsher justice. In such conditions, trust frayed. The very people who once helped you raise your barn might now guard their root cellar with a cudgel. But when things went well, community spirit shone. Villagers shared not just food but labor. Winter was often the time for collective projects, mending roads, clearing ditches, or repairing the church roof. These weren't just chores, they were survival strategies that benefited everyone. Working together made the cold more bearable, and it fostered a sense of unity that kept despair at bay. Plus, it gave everyone a chance to gossip, which was the medieval equivalent of social media. For the poorest, survival often hinged entirely on others' goodwill. Widows, orphans, and the elderly relied on neighbors to bring food, firewood, or clothing. Without this support, they were among the first casualties of winter. Begging increased during the cold months, with travelers and local poor alike seeking scraps from door to door. Some villagers resented them, but others viewed giving alms as a way to secure blessings, or at least hedge their bets with heaven. After all, better to hand over half a loaf than risk your soul for eternity. There were also traditions designed to encourage sharing. Seasonal festivals often included communal feasts, where wealthier households provided food for all. These moments weren't just about celebration. They were pressure valves, giving everyone a temporary reprieve from hunger and reinforcing the idea that survival was collective. Singing, dancing, and eating together reminded villagers that they weren't suffering alone. Yet beneath this veneer of cooperation, tension simmered. Winter sharpened the lines between the haves and have-nots. Wealthier farmers who could better stockpile grain or had larger herds inevitably lived more comfortably. Poorer families, scraping by with withered carrots and bark bread, noticed the difference. Resentment grew, sometimes spilling into open conflict. Records tell of theft, disputes over gleaning rights, and even small riots when lords withheld supplies during famine years. Nothing soured community spirit like the realization that your neighbor's cellar still had food while yours was bare. And still, even in the most desperate times, there were acts of selflessness. A loaf of bread split in half, a blanket shared, a child taken in by a neighbor after its parents died of fever. These moments stitched villages together. Survival wasn't just about calories and firewood, it was about trust, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to let each other perish. The paradox of medieval community was that it was both lifeline and threat. Together, villagers could endure the cold, patch roofs, share food, and survive. But one weak harvest or one bad winter, and suspicion, envy, and fear could unravel the bonds that held them. Winter revealed both the best and the worst in people, forcing them to decide whether to share their last onion with Bob or guard it like treasure while Bob wasted away. Next, we'll explore how even the act of eating itself was dictated by another powerful force in winter, the church's calendar of feasts and fasts. which could mean sudden moments of indulgence or long stretches of enforced hunger that felt less like piety and more like punishment. If you thought winter meals were bleak because of famine and poor storage, allow me to introduce you to an additional layer of misery: the church. Medieval life revolved around religion, and so did eating. The church didn't just tell you when to pray or confess. It also told you what you could and couldn't put in your mouth. The result was a dizzying calendar of feasts and fasts that could transform an already thin diet into an exercise in holy endurance. The church said, "No meat today." Your stomach said, "But I'm already on the no-food diet." Let's start with fast days. These weren't the occasional skip-a-snack gestures we think of today. They were frequent, mandatory, and long. Every Friday, meat was forbidden. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, banned it entirely, along with animal fats, cheese, and milk in many traditions. Advent, the season before Christmas, often carried its own restrictions. Add to that numerous saints' days, vigils, and random periods of enforced abstinence, and suddenly a medieval farmer's calendar was peppered with more no days than yes. Depending on the region and the century, almost half the year could be classified as fasting days. Now, what did fasting actually mean? For the most part, it didn't require total abstinence from food, but rather abstaining from certain foods, chiefly meat. This left fish, vegetables, bread, and if you were lucky, eggs, though even those were often restricted during Lent. On paper, this might sound manageable, but in practice it meant eating barrels of pickled herring and dried cod while glaring resentfully at your neighbor's pig. For peasants who only had a scrap of meat to begin with, fasting felt less like spiritual discipline and more like cosmic mockery. "No meat today," declared the priest. "That's fine," muttered the farmer. "I haven't had meat in 3 weeks anyway." The monotony was punishing. Imagine dragging yourself through a February afternoon of hunger only to sit down to fish. Again, dried, salted, smoked, boiled fish in every possible form except appetizing. The smell alone could haunt a household. Children groaned, adults forced smiles, and everyone secretly prayed for Lent to hurry up. There were even stories of peasants sneaking scraps of pork fat into their stews, just enough to flavor it, hoping God was too busy smiting sinners elsewhere to notice their culinary rebellion. But fasting had a flip side: feasts. The church calendar was also studded with holy days and festivals, and when those arrived, the tables turned literally. On feast days, the ordinary rules of scarcity bent. Lords threw banquets, monasteries cooked up extra bread and ale, and even peasants might find themselves gnawing on a bit of roast meat or enjoying a rare sweet treat. Christmas was a particular highlight. Families slaughtered animals in late autumn precisely so they could indulge during the 12 days of Christmas. For a brief moment, the bleakness of winter softened into merriment, laughter, and the miracle of full bellies. Carnival, the raucous period before Lent, was another burst of indulgence. People ate, drank, and partied as if trying to store joy for the lean weeks ahead. Pancakes, pies, sausages, anything rich and fatty was devoured with reckless abandon. The underlying idea was spiritual: gorge now, repent later. But to the average peasant, it was simply the one time of year when the pot actually smelled of meat instead of onions. The feast and fast rhythm gave structure to winter, but it also reinforced hierarchy. Lords and clergy had the means to feast lavishly, even on fast days, by leaning on loopholes. For example, beavers and barnacle geese were sometimes classified as fish, meaning wealthy tables still served up roasted fish with suspiciously meaty textures. Peasants, meanwhile, were left with watery pottage and whatever dried cod they could stomach. The rules were the same in theory, but in practice, the rich experienced fasting as mild inconvenience, while the poor experienced it as misery squared. Still, there was a sense of community in this shared rhythm. Everyone knew when fast days fell, when feasts arrived, and when Lent loomed. Villages planned celebrations together, churches organized communal meals, and even the act of abstaining bound people in collective suffering. It was cultural glue keeping society in step with the church's liturgical drumbeat. You weren't just starving alone, you were starving with friends, and somehow that made it bearable. The religious restrictions also shaped medieval food culture long-term. The heavy reliance on fish during fast days spurred massive fishing industries, with herring and cod becoming staples across Europe. Monasteries perfected brewing and baking in part because they needed reliable, fast-friendly fare. Even today, traditions like eating pancakes on Shrove Tuesday or fish on Fridays trace their roots back to this medieval balancing act between sin, stomach, and salvation. But for the farmer huddled by his smoky hearth in February, those grand cultural legacies meant little. All he knew was that he was hungry. The priest had just banned meat again, and he was staring at another bowl of thin stew. His faith may have been strong, but his stomach growled louder than the church bells. Next, we'll step away from the adult struggles and see how winter bore down on the youngest members of the household, children whose daily lives were less about play and more about hauling water, feeding animals, and trying not to freeze before bedtime. When we think of childhood, we often imagine carefree games, laughter, and long afternoons of play. Now erase all of that. Replace it with shivering in a smoky hut, hauling buckets of icy water, and praying your socks didn't have holes the size of your toes. Childhood dreams? Warm socks. In medieval winters, children weren't sheltered from hardship. They were frontline workers in the family's survival plan. From the moment a child could toddle without falling face first into the mud, they were given chores. Winter didn't mean a holiday from farming. It meant a new set of tasks designed to keep everyone alive until the thaw. Feeding animals was one of the most basic jobs. Children trudged out in the snow carrying armfuls of hay for cows and goats, scattering grain for chickens, or trying to coax pigs out of their straw nests. A misstep meant dropping the precious food in the snow and watching it vanish into slush, not the sort of mistake anyone wanted to explain to their hungry parents. Thatching wood was another endless duty. Fires had to be fed constantly, and that meant daily trips to gather sticks, logs, or even bundles of brush. Imagine small children dragging oversized branches across the frozen ground, fingers red and raw, faces stung by wind. No one said, "You're too young or you'll catch a cold." Catching a cold was inevitable. Not gathering wood meant the whole family froze. Kids often became human kindling carriers, returning again and again from the forest or pile outside until their arms ached. Spinning wool was a more indoor-friendly task, but no less monotonous. Girls in particular spent hours near the hearth, learning to card, spin, and wind thread onto spindles. It wasn't just practice, it was production. Every skein of yarn meant another garment, another chance to face the cold with something more than rags. Childhood play often blended into work. A spindle wasn't a toy, but it was always in your hands. Drop it too many times, though, and expect scolding sharper than the wool's itch. Water fetching was perhaps the most dreaded job of all. Wells and streams didn't take winter breaks, and families needed water for cooking, brewing, and cleaning. Children hauled heavy buckets through snow, sometimes breaking ice to reach the supply. Spill even half a bucket on the way back and you'd hear about it until next Christmas. The irony was that the water often froze before you even made it home, leaving you to present your parents with a bucket-shaped ice cube. Congratulations, you'd invented the medieval slushie. Playtime did exist, but it was squeezed in between duties. Snow became an impromptu playground. Children threw snowballs, slid on frozen ponds, and carved little toys from wood or bone. But even these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the constant demands of survival. If your parents caught you rolling in the snow while the goats bleated unfed, you could expect a lecture about responsibility delivered with all the warmth of a frozen turnip. School, for most peasant children, was a distant dream. Winter mornings weren't spent reciting prayers over parchment, they were spent gathering fuel, tending animals, or patching clothes. Education was survival training: how to split wood, how to spin yarn, how to recognize when a sheep was about to keel over. Childhood wasn't preparation for adulthood, it was participation in it right from the start. For poorer families, children's survival was even more precarious. Winter was brutal on small bodies, and child mortality soared in the cold months. Weak immune systems, hunger, and relentless exposure made fevers and frostbite common. Families sometimes lost multiple children in one season, and though grief was deep, it was also familiar. In a world where every mouth was both a joy and a burden, parents lived with a heartbreaking mix of love and practicality. Yet, despite the drudgery, children brought energy and resilience to winter life. They carried firewood singing songs, invented games out of scraps, and found laughter even while hauling buckets through snow. Their small size made them ideal for certain jobs, slipping into tight animal pens, retrieving items dropped into storage pits, or helping older siblings with weaving or sewing. Childhood wasn't carefree, but it was vital. Without children's labor, survival for many families would have been impossible, and let's not forget the humor children brought. Even in the bleakest winters, children found ways to mock the absurdity of life. They imitated the bleating of goats, sang silly rhymes about empty bellies, or teased each other about who smelled most like the pigs they were forced to bunk with. Parents may have sighed at their antics, but those bursts of laughter cut through the gloom as effectively as any fire. Ultimately, medieval childhood in winter was a paradox. It was hard, sometimes tragic, and almost entirely devoid of what we consider play. But it was also formative. Children grew up resilient, capable, and deeply tied to the rhythms of survival. They didn't have the luxury of imagining adulthood. It was thrust upon them with their first bucket of water or spindle of wool. Next, we'll set aside the children's labors and look at how families found something else to get them through the long nights. Stories, songs, and tales spun around the hearth that kept spirits alive even when bellies were empty, when the fields were frozen, the animals asleep in their pens, and supper had been choked down a watery pottage if you were lucky, a chunk of stale bread if you weren't. Medieval families turned to one of the few luxuries winter actually allowed: stories and songs. Winter evenings by the hearth weren't just about staying warm. They were about keeping your mind alive when your body was trapped in a smoky hut. Netflix buffering, no worries. You had Grandpa's 4-hour ghost story. In a world without books for most peasants, storytelling was the entertainment system. The school and the community news bulletin rolled into one. Tales ranged from family legends to biblical parables, from heroic adventures to cautionary fables about what happened to the fool who forgot to store enough grain. A grandfather might tell of winters worse than this one, because every grandfather in history has claimed he lived through the hardest winters. Back in my day, he'd begin, the snow was taller than the church steeple, and we survived 3 weeks on nothing but turnip peelings and courage. Children rolled their eyes, but they listened anyway, because exaggeration was half the fun. Songs filled the gaps where stories left off. Folk songs about saints, harvests, or local heroes passed the time while wool was spun or tools mended. Rhythmic work songs kept hands moving in the dim light, and lullabies soothed children too tired to keep their eyes open. Sometimes songs were bawdy, full of jokes that made the older children snicker and the adults pretend not to laugh. Humor was a necessity, not a luxury when you were coughing from smoke and freezing drafts. A funny verse about a drunken miller tumbling into his own flour sack could feel like a balm. The communal nature of these evenings mattered as much as the stories themselves. Families, often extended ones, gathered close around the hearth, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors sometimes joined in, especially during stormy nights when travel was impossible and company was a relief. It was survival by togetherness, not just in body heat, but in spirit. A shared story lightened hunger. A familiar song reminded you that you weren't enduring this misery alone. Stories also doubled as lessons. Children learned through them which herbs healed, which saints protected, what behavior might anger God or the local lord. Practical knowledge was disguised in entertainment. A tale about a lazy farmer who wasted his grain was less bedtime story and more public service announcement. In this way, folklore became the curriculum of peasant life, passing down wisdom in a world where parchment was more expensive than your house. Ghost stories and supernatural tales had their special place too. Winter nights were long, and the creak of rafters or howl of the wind begged for eerie explanations. spirits, witches and fairies danced in the imagination, as real in the mind as wolves in the forest. Parents might use these tales to keep children from wandering outside. Don't go into the snow or the white lady will carry you away. Fear kept kids indoors, safe from frostbite or worse, but it also gave them nightmares and something to whisper about under their itchy wool blankets. Music wasn't always live either. There were instruments, though simple ones, a shepherd's pipe, a drum made from stretched animal skin, or a crude fiddle might appear, transforming the hut into a miniature concert hall. The quality of performance varied, of course. A poorly played pipe might sound like a goat in distress, but when your entertainment choices were limited, you learned to clap along anyway. The church also influenced these winter evenings. Hymns and carols were sung during religious festivals, weaving devotion into the fabric of daily survival. By singing together, villagers reinforced not only faith but community bonds. Even those skeptical about the priest's warnings found comfort in music that united everyone in voice, if not always in pitch. And yet the beauty of these evenings lay in their ordinariness. A candle sputtering, a fire crackling, children drifting to sleep while their parents told stories about kings, saints, or mischievous foxes. Life was harsh, food was thin, but imagination filled the gaps hunger left behind. For a few hours each night, peasants weren't just cold, coughing farmers. They were heroes, listeners, singers, and dreamers. Humor, too, was woven into the fabric of storytelling. Medieval jokes weren't always sophisticated. Many involved bodily functions, greedy priests, or gullible neighbors, but they were effective. Laughter was rebellion against the cold. When you laughed at the miller's greed or the monk's clumsiness in a story, you momentarily forgot the ache in your stomach, and sometimes that was enough. Ultimately, stories and songs were more than entertainment. They were survival tools. They kept minds sharp, spirits hopeful, and communities tied together when the world outside seemed intent on breaking them apart. They gave meaning to monotonous nights and turned the howl of the wind into background music for tales of giants, saints, and tricksters. Next, we'll step away from the quiet hearth and look at the louder, more boisterous side of winter, holiday relief. For just a few days each year, Christmas, Epiphany, and Carnival brought bursts of feasting, drinking, and merrymaking, a brief but glorious break from the monotony of turnips and pottage. If medieval winter was a months-long punishment, then holiday festivals were the occasional candy bribe to keep everyone from despairing completely. Christmas, Epiphany, and Carnival weren't just religious observances. They were the bright, chaotic bursts of food, drink, and merrymaking that made the endless cold slightly more bearable. They were the calendar's way of saying, eat now, regret later, starve tomorrow. Christmas was the season's crown jewel. Though stripped of many modern trappings, it still carried a sense of magic and excess. Families slaughtered animals in late autumn, partly to ensure meat would be ready for winter feasting, and by Christmas the salted pork, roasted goose, or, if you were rich, beef and venison finally appeared on tables. For peasants it might mean one rare indulgence, a bit of meat in their pottage, a small pie filled with whatever scraps they'd saved, or even a honey cake baked from precious ingredients. It wasn't abundance, but compared to the monotony of stale bread and watery stew, it felt like dining at a king's table. And it wasn't just about food, it was about community. Villages came together for services, carols, and processions, warming themselves with shared ritual as much as with ale. Lords often hosted feasts for their tenants, partly out of generosity, partly because sharing food kept rebellion at bay. Imagine a barn filled with trestle tables, people eating, singing, and laughing, all while knowing perfectly well that by January the turnips would be back with a vengeance. But for a few glorious days bellies were full and spirits were high. Then came Epiphany, on January 6th, marking the arrival of the Magi in Christian tradition. This feast, though less lavish than Christmas, still brought merriment. In some regions, people baked king cakes with hidden beans inside. The lucky finder was crowned the king of the feast for the day, given a paper crown and perhaps authority to mockingly boss everyone around. Of course, if you were a peasant crowned king for the night, The only thing you truly ruled was the privilege of going back to chores the next morning, but still it was fun while it lasted. By the time Carnival rolled around, however, people were ready for a blowout. Carnival, the festival before the long austerity of Lent, was the medieval equivalent of go big before you go home. Food that couldn't be eaten during Lent, meat, dairy, eggs, was devoured in enormous quantities. Pancakes, sausages, pies and custards filled tables. Ale and wine flowed, songs grew rowdier, and masks and costumes appeared in the streets. Carnival was a time for turning the world upside down. Peasants mocked lords, fools became kings, and the normally rigid social order bent, if only for a day. Of course, this temporary indulgence came with consequences. Feasting before Lent was less about joy and more about survival mathematics. If you didn't eat it now, it would spoil, so you gorged, laughed, and staggered away from the table clutching your stomach, fully aware that in a week you'd be gnawing on pickled fish again. Eat now, regret later wasn't just a saying, it was a seasonal lifestyle. The psychological relief these holidays provided can't be overstated. Winter was monotonous, dark, and exhausting. Festivals broke the cycle, gave people something to anticipate, and recharged the spirit. Even poor families, who might not have much to contribute, found joy in song, games, and laughter. Children got small treats, candied nuts, little toys carved from wood. Adults relished the rare chance to eat until full, drink until dizzy, and forget that famine was never far away. The church, of course, kept a firm hand on these festivities, reminding people that excess was temporary and repentance mandatory. Still, even priests must have smiled a little as they watched half-frozen villagers laugh their way through carnival parades. After all, keeping faith meant keeping morale, and morale was easier to sustain when bellies were filled with pancakes and ale. Holiday relief also served a social purpose. Sharing food and drink reinforced bonds within the village. Even those with little tried to offer something: an onion, a loaf, a jug of weak ale, because refusing to share during a feast was practically declaring yourself a villain in the next round of gossip. The poorest still gained by being included, and the wealthiest displayed their status by how much they could afford to distribute. These holidays, though brief, stitched communities together with music, laughter, and breadcrumbs. And yet, once the candles guttered out and the leftovers vanished, the harsh reality of winter snapped back. The festival glow faded into the chill of February mornings, with nothing but turnip stew to look forward to. But for a few days, life felt abundant, joyful, even indulgent. Festivals were proof that even in the darkest winters, humans insisted on celebration. Next, we'll turn from communal feasting to the private superstitions that shaped winter life. Omens, charms, and folk wisdom that claimed to predict the weather or ward off disaster, because when nature was cruel, a little magic was often the only comfort left. When you live in a world without meteorologists, satellites, or handy weather apps, predicting the weather is less science and more squinting at a chicken and hoping for the best. For medieval farmers, the stakes of guessing the weather were painfully high. A late frost could kill crops, an early thaw could flood fields, and a surprise snowstorm could finish off livestock. So people turned to the tools they had: animal behavior, holy days, and folklore. If the rooster sneezes, grab an extra blanket. Animals were the first and most obvious weathermen. Cats, for example, were thought to sense storms. If a cat turned its back to the fire, it supposedly meant bad weather was coming. Dogs lying on their backs, pigs restless in their pens, or cows huddling close together all carried messages for farmers who needed reassurance before committing seed to soil. Chickens, especially, were watched like feathery prophets. A rooster crowing at an odd hour meant changing skies. If he sneezed, well, you could expect to wake up with frost on your nose. Farmers didn't need official forecasts. They had an entire barnyard of unwilling meteorological interns. Holy days offered another guide. The church calendar was peppered with saints' days, each tied to weather predictions. St. Swithin's Day in July promised 40 days of rain if it rained on that morning. Candlemas in February was especially dreaded. It was said that if the day was bright, winter would linger, but if it was stormy, spring would come sooner. Sound familiar? Yes, Candlemas superstitions are cousins to America's Groundhog Day, except instead of a rodent, it was clergy with candles trying to guess when the frost would loosen its grip. Imagine trusting your harvest to whether Brother Matthew thought the sky looked a bit too cheerful. Folklore filled in the rest. Proverbs guided peasants through the seasons. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning. Or, if the ash before the oak, then you may expect a soak. These sayings, passed down through generations, were often rooted in observed patterns, though whether they held true every time is debatable. Still, in a world where guessing wrong could mean hunger, even half-reliable wisdom was better than nothing. Clouds and stars provided another kind of guidance. A halo around the moon was a sure sign of snow. Stars that twinkled too brightly promised wind. Clouds shaped like mackerel scales, rippling patterns across the sky, meant storms. Farmers didn't just glance at the heavens. They studied them with the desperation of people whose survival depended on knowing whether tomorrow would bring mud or frost. To them, the night sky wasn't romantic. It was a weather report written in riddles. Superstition also bled into magical thinking. Charms were whispered to ward off hailstorms, and crosses were marked on doors to protect against lightning. Some believed witches could control weather, and misfortunes were often blamed on a neighbor's curse. If your hay rotted in the field, maybe you hadn't just mistimed the harvest, maybe Agnes down the lane had hexed your oxen. Weather wasn't just natural, it was personal, an invisible battlefield where saints, demons, and your neighbor's bad vibes all played roles. These beliefs weren't silly to those who held them. They were survival strategies. Without reliable science, folklore gave people a framework for understanding chaos. It provided comfort. If you could predict or influence the weather, you weren't completely powerless against nature's cruelty. Even if it didn't always work, at least it gave you something to do besides shiver and hope. Community life often reinforced these practices. Villagers shared observations. If someone swore they saw geese flying unusually low, everyone braced for storms. If the priest announced after Mass that Candlemas skies looked favorable, people left church a little lighter in spirit. Gossip and superstition wove together into a patchwork forecasting system, one that sometimes failed spectacularly but kept people talking and preparing. Winter, of course, magnified these anxieties. With supplies dwindling, the difference between an early thaw and 6 more weeks of snow could mean life or death. Families hung on every sign, desperate for hope that spring was on its way. The first sight of snowdrops pushing through the frost wasn't just a flower, it was a miracle. The croak of frogs from a thawed marsh was a symphony of survival. Until then, every sneeze of a rooster, every restless pig, every cloudy halo around the moon was studied like a divine text. In hindsight, these superstitions seem quaint, but they reveal the very real human need to make sense of uncertainty. When survival hung by a thread, people sought patterns anywhere they could find them, in the stars, in animals, in church candles, in whispered proverbs. Were they accurate? Sometimes. Were they reassuring? Always. And sometimes reassurance was the only thing standing between despair and determination. Next, we'll shift from weather worries to another hazard of medieval winter life: war. Because, as it turns out, raiders and lords didn't always hibernate, and nothing ruins a cozy night by the hearth quite like the sound of a siege engine rolling through the snow. When you think of medieval winter, you probably imagine farmers huddled in smoky huts, quietly trying not to starve. And for the most part, you'd be right. But every so often, winter brought a very different kind of drama, the thundering arrival of soldiers at your gate. Lords didn't always take the season off, and raiders definitely didn't hibernate. Nothing says surprise like a January siege. Warfare in winter might sound impractical. Snowdrifts, frozen rivers, and bone-deep cold aren't exactly soldier-friendly, but sometimes those very conditions made it easier. Frozen ground meant wagons and cavalry could move more smoothly than in the mud of spring or autumn. Ice turned rivers into highways, allowing troops to cross where bridges normally dictated strategy. And of course, striking in the dead of winter gave you the element of shock. Villagers expected famine in February, not flaming torches at their doors. For peasants, the timing couldn't be worse. Winter already stripped them of resources. What little food remained was carefully rationed for survival. When raiders arrived, they didn't just burn houses, they emptied granaries, seized livestock and trampled fields meant for spring planting. It was destruction at its cruelest, robbing you not only of today's dinner but tomorrow's survival. Imagine watching the one cow you'd kept alive all winter being led away by soldiers who considered it nothing more than supper on hooves. Lords, of course, had their reasons. Warfare was as much about intimidation as about conquest. Striking in winter sent a message: we don't care about the cold, and we know you're too weak to fight back. Smaller villages were especially vulnerable, their defenses laughable against organized troops. Fortified castles fared better, but even they weren't immune. A siege in January meant cutting off supplies when villagers already had nothing to spare. Starving out your enemy was twice as effective when hunger was already doing most of the work. Conditions for soldiers were hardly rosy, though. They too suffered frostbite, hunger, and disease. Marching in snow, sleeping in damp tents, and gnawing on hard rations made morale plummet. But necessity and ambition often overruled comfort. Mercenaries needed pay, lords needed prestige, and conflicts didn't politely pause just because the weather was miserable. If anything, winter campaigns tested endurance as much as military skill. For the average farmer, however, distinctions between noble ambition and peasant misery didn't matter. All you knew was that your haystack was now on fire, your children were crying, and your roof beams were one torch away from becoming a bonfire. War wasn't something fought far away on battlefields. It was something that rolled straight into your yard, demanding bread, ale, or your last surviving goat. And then there were the opportunists. Bandits and small raiding parties thrived in winter. With villagers weakened and guards distracted, it was the perfect time to loot. Imagine trudging home from gathering firewood only to find strangers hauling sacks out of your cellar. Shouting for help might bring the neighbors, but if they were starving too, you couldn't always count on them to fight. Sometimes the safest strategy was to hide under the straw and hope the raiders didn't notice you breathing. Communities developed defenses crude but earnest. Watchmen were posted at village edges, bells or horns signaled danger, and fortified churches served as last refuges. But peasants armed with pitchforks were no match for mounted knights. Resistance often meant brutal reprisals, burned houses, destroyed tools, and bodies left in the snow as warnings. Survival often depended on submission, handing over food, animals, and loyalty in exchange for being left alive. The psychological toll was just as heavy as the physical destruction. Winter was supposed to be predictable in its misery: hunger, cold, and boredom. War shattered that routine with fear. Suddenly, the smoke rising in the distance wasn't from someone's hearth but from your neighbor's burning barn. Parents soothed children not only from hunger but from nightmares of armored men crashing through the door. Winter warfare made peasants feel doubly trapped, nature and humanity alike conspiring against them. Ironically, the church sometimes tried to restrain such winter violence. Decrees like the Truce of God limited when and how lords could fight, forbidding attacks on holy days or during certain liturgical seasons. But enforcement was patchy, and ambition rarely bowed to piety. If you had the chance to crush your rival while his peasants gnawed on bark bread, divine rules tended to slip conveniently out of mind. And yet, despite the terror, life went on. Villagers rebuilt burned homes, rethatched roofs, and patched up their lives with the same stubbornness they used against frost and famine. Stories of raids became part of oral history, retold around the hearth as warnings and grim jokes. Remember the winter when the soldiers stole all the pigs? At least they didn't take the chickens. Dark humor was often the only balm left after the ashes cooled. So while we picture knights jousting in summer tournaments or clashing on bright green fields, the reality for many medieval farmers was far grimmer. War didn't wait for warm weather. It could arrive in the dead of January with fire, swords, and shouted commands, reducing months of careful preparation to ruin overnight. Winter was already a predator. War simply joined in the hunt. Next, we'll move from burning barns to frozen roads, exploring the misery of winter travel when every journey meant mud, ice, and the terrifying possibility of getting stuck halfway to nowhere with only an ox cart for company. In the medieval world, travel was already an ordeal in the best of seasons. Roads were little more than rutted dirt tracks. Bridges were scarce and wobbly, and maps, if you even had one, were vague works of imagination. Add winter into the mix, and suddenly even a short trip to the next village became an expedition worthy of an epic poem. Most people stayed put for good reason. Your medieval Uber was 2 oxen and a sled that hated you. The first problem was the roads, or rather, the lack thereof. Heavy rains turned them into sucking swamps of mud. Once the mud froze, the ground became treacherous sheets of ice. Carts got stuck, axle deep, wheels splintered on frozen ruts, and horses slipped as though auditioning for medieval ice dancing. For peasants trudging on foot it was worse. Boots filled with icy water, cloaks dragged through slush, and frostbitten toes that made every step feel like walking on knives. Journeys weren't measured in miles but in how many blisters and curses it took to get there. Then there was the transport itself. Wealthier folk might have a cart or even a horse, but for the average farmer, travel meant walking. If you were lucky, you had an ox pulling a sled, creaking and groaning as it carried a few sacks of grain or a bundle of firewood. Oxen, practical though they were, weren't exactly known for their speed. A trip that should have taken an hour could stretch into half a day, punctuated by frequent stops as the animal decided it was tired, hungry, or simply uninterested in moving forward. Imagine hitching a ride with a driver who refused to accelerate beyond a crawl, stopped to snack every 10 minutes, and occasionally just sat down in the middle of the road. That was your ox. And don't even think about comfort. Carts had no suspension, so every bump jolted your spine like a blacksmith hammering iron. Sleds offered a smoother ride across snow, but they also had a charming habit of tipping over when you least expected it, dumping both passengers and cargo into the nearest snowbank. It was less journey and more constant test of patience and balance. Winter travel also meant a constant threat of getting stranded. Snow piled high in open fields, blurring paths until even locals could lose their way. A sudden blizzard could trap travelers for days, forcing them to huddle under cloaks while their food ran out, and their oxen looked at them with the silent judgment of animals that always knew this was a bad idea. Rivers, when frozen, became both blessing and curse. Cross them and you saved time, unless the ice cracked, in which case you saved no one, least of all yourself. Inns, contrary to romantic notions, were rare and usually clustered along major trade routes. Most travelers relied on monasteries for shelter or begged hospitality from strangers. That meant your nightly accommodations ranged from a straw mattress in a monastery guest hall to the corner of a stranger's barn shared with chickens. If you were unlucky, you slept in the open, huddled under your cloak with frost settling on your eyebrows. And yes, sometimes you woke up to find your boots frozen solid to the ground. The dangers went beyond cold and discomfort. Bandits loved winter roads. Hungry, desperate, and emboldened by travelers' vulnerability, they prowled forests and crossroads. With daylight short and visibility low, ambushes were all too easy. Carrying anything of value, a sack of grain, a bolt of cloth, or heaven forbid coins, was like painting a target on your back. Few peasants dared travel far, and those who did often joined caravans or clung to the protection of lords' retinues. Safety in numbers was the only insurance available. Despite these hardships, some travel couldn't be avoided. Markets still beckoned. Villagers needed to trade surplus goods, buy salt, or pay rents and tithes. Lords demanded services, kings summoned men for war, and the church expected attendance at festivals or pilgrimages. Obligations didn't stop for snow, so people went, grumbling, praying, and cursing their oxen along the way. Pilgrims in particular braved the roads, trudging through slush toward shrines with the hope that enduring frozen mud might win them heavenly favor. If nothing else, it certainly tested their patience, and yet stories of winter journeys became part of the culture. Ballads spoke of lovers trudging through snow to meet in distant villages, saints crossing frozen rivers by miracle, and soldiers marching across icy fields to victory. For every miserable peasant who slipped face first into a ditch, there was a tale to tell by the fire later, half complaint, half comedy. Winter travel embodied the paradox of medieval life, unavoidable yet dreaded, slow yet dangerous, necessary yet absurd. People walked because they had to, not because they wanted to. Journeys weren't adventures, they were chores that risked hypothermia. And still humanity trudged on, because obligations didn't care about frostbite. If there's one thing winter did better than frostbite, it was highlighting just how uneven life in the Middle Ages could be. The season was a magnifying glass for inequality, exposing in brutal clarity who had roaring fires and roasted boar, and who had a smoky hearth, a carrot, and the faint hope of spring. Your lord had roasted boar, you had boiled disappointment. For peasants, winter meant rationing, monotony, and despair. Their homes were draughty one-room huts, patched with mud and straw, barely insulated against icy winds. Fires smoked more than they heated, and the only warmth often came from huddling together under threadbare wool blankets, or from the cow you reluctantly shared the room with. Supper was pottage so thin it might legally have been classified as water, with the occasional crust of rye bread that could chip a tooth. If meat appeared at all, it was a scrap of salted pork doled out like treasure. Hunger was constant, boredom gnawed harder than rats, and survival was the only luxury they could aspire to. Now shift the scene to the manor hall. While peasants gnawed crusts, lords reclined at tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines and pastries. Great hearths blazed with logs as thick as tree trunks. Firewood peasants couldn't even dream of affording. Tapestries hung on the walls, not just to show off wealth but also to insulate the stone halls against the chill. Nobles wrapped themselves in fine wool, velvet and furs, while servants darted about filling goblets and carving meat. In short, winter was still uncomfortable, but it was uncomfortable in silk. The contrast in diet was especially stark. While peasants boiled cabbage and turnips, nobles dined on roasted venison, capons and exotic dishes seasoned with expensive spices imported from afar. Sugar, cinnamon and cloves appeared at aristocratic feasts like magic, while peasants considered themselves lucky to have onions. To add insult to injury, many of the animals slaughtered and preserved in autumn by peasants went straight into the larders of the lord's household. You raised the pig, you salted the pork, but you didn't get to eat it. Survival for the poor often meant providing luxury for the rich. Even during religious fasts, when meat was technically forbidden, nobles found ways to bend the rules. While peasants choked down salted fish until they wanted to throw the barrel into the nearest river, nobles dined on fast-approved delicacies, almond milk puddings, elaborate fish pies, or even beaver tails, classified as fish thanks to their aquatic habits. In other words, fasting for the rich was a mild inconvenience. Fasting for the poor was starvation with extra steps. Housing was another divide. A peasant's hut had dirt floors, smoky rafters, and a roof that leaked as much as it sheltered. By January, the place smelled like a stew of smoke, manure, and damp wool. Nobles, meanwhile, lived in castles or manor houses with multiple rooms, stone walls, and servants, whose job it was to keep the fire blazing. Yes, castles were drafty and cold by modern standards, but compared to a mud hut with a goat chewing the bedstraw, they were palaces of comfort. The divide extended into health. A peasant falling sick in February faced herbs, prayers, and maybe bloodletting if a village healer took a look. A noble, by contrast, might summon a trained physician, access rare medicines, or retreat to warmer, sunnier estates if they had the wealth to travel. Survival wasn't just about resilience, it was about status. The poor endured, the rich avoided, and let's not forget entertainment. For peasants, winter evenings meant spinning wool, mending tools, and telling stories in the dim light of a rush candle. For nobles, it meant hunting in snowy forests, hosting banquets, listening to music, or enjoying performances by jesters and minstrels. One group fought boredom with folk tales. The other paid someone to juggle in front of a roaring fire. The irony, of course, was that the rich depended entirely on the poor to maintain their comfort. Servants kept the fires burning, cooks prepared the meals, and laborers provided the food. The very same peasants shivering in hovels were the reason the lord could dine on goose in his great hall. The divide wasn't just economic, it was structural, baked into the very order of medieval society. This disparity was most obvious during times of crisis. In a famine year, peasants perished in droves while nobles tightened belts slightly but survived. In harsh winters, villages shrank as the poorest families succumbed to hunger, while the manor still hosted feasts. The church preached charity, and sometimes nobles did distribute alms or firewood, but it was rarely enough. Generosity was measured not in whether peasants lived comfortably, but in whether they lived at all. And yet, despite the misery, peasants often took pride in endurance. To survive a winter with little but stale bread and smoky fires was its own badge of honor. The rich might have roasted boar, but the poor had resilience. And sometimes, resilience was the only thing that carried them into spring. A bad winter was cruel. A famine year was apocalyptic. For most medieval farmers, hunger was a steady companion, but when harvests failed across entire regions, survival tipped from difficult to nearly impossible. Fields yielded little, stores emptied too soon, and rumors spread of horrors no one wanted to believe. The medieval version of dieting, but involuntary and deadly. Failed harvests were the first domino. Sometimes it was relentless rain that drowned fields in mud. Other years it was drought that baked soil into stone. Grain rotted in the ground or withered before ripening. Once that happened, the entire cycle of survival unraveled. Bread, the bedrock of the medieval diet, became scarce. The prices of grain skyrocketed, and the poorest families could barely afford a handful of flour. The phrase "bread is life" wasn't poetic, it was literal. Without it, you starved. Food reserves, already meager, ran out months before spring. The hunger gap, normally an annual test of patience, stretched into a season-long crisis. Peasants boiled weeds, chewed on tree bark, and made bread from ground acorns or straw. These substitutions filled stomachs but offered little nutrition, leaving bodies weak and vulnerable. Desperation bred creativity, but creativity rarely cured hunger. One chronicle even described people mixing clay into bread. Better to eat something, however inedible, than nothing at all. Animals, too, vanished from the table. Livestock that survived the autumn cull was slaughtered early, leaving no breeding stock for the future. Chickens, goats, and pigs disappeared into stew pots, thinning out village farms until they resembled empty barns. Hunting might seem like an option, but game was scarce and often reserved for lords. Poaching a deer to feed your family could result in losing a hand or your head, so peasants turned to smaller prey: rabbits, birds, even vermin. If it moved, it was considered protein. Diseases flourished alongside hunger. Malnutrition weakened bodies, and epidemics followed close behind. Fevers, dysentery, and plague spread through weakened populations like sparks in dry thatch. Death rates soared. In some regions, famine years wiped out entire villages, leaving behind only empty huts and abandoned fields. Survival wasn't just about enduring hunger, it was about dodging every sickness that hunger invited in. And then there were the whispers, the dark, unsettling rumors of cannibalism. Chronicles describe mothers abandoning children, families scavenging corpses, and in the bleakest accounts, people consuming each other to survive. Were all these stories true? Perhaps not. Chroniclers often exaggerated to shock readers or to moralize about sin and punishment. But in a world where bread was worth more than gold, it's not unthinkable that some desperate souls crossed the final horrific line. Even the existence of such rumors tells us how deep the fear of starvation ran. The famine of 1315 to 1317, often called the Great Famine, offers one of the starkest examples. Unseasonable rains destroyed harvests across Europe for multiple years. Cattle died in droves from disease and grain failed repeatedly. Chroniclers wrote of people eating cats, dogs, and worse. Millions perished. and those who lived carried the trauma with them for generations. Parents told children the stories as warnings: always store food, always respect the cycles of the land, because famine is never far away. Religion was both a comfort and a source of guilt. Priests urged fasting, but fasting meant little when fasting was already life. Processions, prayers, and offerings were made to saints in the hope of divine mercy. People confessed sins, convinced famine was God's punishment for their wickedness. Entire communities marched barefoot in penitence, chanting in the snow, hoping heaven would trade forgiveness for bread. Sometimes it rained afterward, which strengthened faith. Other times, the skies stayed stubbornly empty, and hope thinned along with bellies. Social structures buckled under famine's pressure. Villagers begged at monastery doors, but even monks ran low on bread. Lords demanded rents in grain or coin when peasants barely had crumbs. Some landholders showed mercy, reducing dues or offering alms. Others pressed harder, tightening their grip until resentment festered. Peasant revolts were rare during famines. They were too weak to rise, but discontent smoldered, ready to ignite when strength returned. Famine didn't just kill, it reshaped communities. Families migrated in search of food, swelling towns with desperate newcomers. Villages shrank as households disappeared, either by death or by flight. Those who endured adapted by diversifying crops, storing more aggressively, or forging tighter communal bonds. But the scars lingered. Famine years etched fear into cultural memory, a reminder that one bad harvest could unravel civilization at the seams. And yet, even in famine, humanity showed resilience. Songs and stories remembered the suffering, sometimes with grim humor. Jokes emerged about bark bread being better than nothing but only slightly. Neighbors shared scraps when they could, mothers gave their portions to children, and communities buried their dead with dignity, even when graves outnumbered feasts. People endured because they had to, and because even famine could not erase the stubborn instinct to survive. When we look back at the endless bone-cracking winters of the Middle Ages, it's tempting to see nothing but misery: smoke-filled huts, stale bread, and the joyless embrace of turnips. Yet these winters left behind more than frostbite and famine. They carved resilience into the very bones of medieval society. They shaped culture, folklore, and community in ways we still feel today. And they left us with one very important lesson: stop complaining about your lukewarm latte. At least your breakfast isn't a turnip stored since October. Survival through winter required not only physical endurance but also a mental toolkit of stories, songs, and rituals. Tales told around the hearth weren't just entertainment, they were survival manuals disguised as ghost stories and jokes. Proverbs about red skies and roosters sneezing carried kernels of weather wisdom. Songs lightened the crushing monotony of chores. Even humor, often crude, often dark, was a weapon against despair. Folklore didn't just pass the time, it passed on the resilience that made endurance possible. Community, too, was reshaped by winter. Villages survived not because each family hoarded alone, but because people shared, traded, and occasionally sacrificed for one another. Alms given at the church door, neighbors helping patch a roof, or a loaf of bread split 3 ways. These weren't acts of charity so much as acts of survival. The bonds formed during winter hardship carried into spring, reinforcing the idea that endurance was a collective effort. If one person starved, it threatened the whole. If one family pulled through, others gained hope. Medieval winters were merciless, but they forced people to remember that survival was a group project. Even religion bent itself around winter. Fast days, feast days, and holy rituals became intertwined with the rhythm of survival. Fasting might have felt absurd when people were already hungry, but it gave shape to suffering, turning chaos into a schedule. Feasts provided desperately needed relief, and gave spiritual weight to the act of eating well, if only briefly. Prayer became the language of endurance, whether it brought rain, snow, or simply comfort. Winter cemented faith not because it was easy, but because when you're gnawing bark bread and shivering by a dying fire, you need to believe someone out there is listening. winter also left its fingerprints on architecture, clothing and food traditions that stretched far beyond the Middle Ages. Root cellars evolved into modern pantries. Wool and fur layering still influences how we think about dressing for cold weather. Even brewing ale, that liquid bread of survival, became the ancestor of Europe's rich beer culture. Entire industries and customs were born because winter forced people to innovate or perish. The legacy is cultural as much as practical. When we read medieval folklore or sing carols with ancient roots, we're brushing against the survival tactics of people who knew real cold and real hunger. Their resilience became ritual, their suffering became story, and their determination became tradition. What we inherit today isn't their misery, it's their creativity, their humor, and their refusal to let winter have the last laugh. And while modern life has insulated us with central heating, hot water taps and grocery stores bursting with food even in January, the echoes remain. We still complain about winter, we still bond over meals and stories during the cold months, and we still treat survival, albeit in more comfortable forms, as a communal act. Our suffering may be exaggerated. My phone froze in the snow. But the rhythm of winter shaping human culture is older than memory itself. So next time you shiver on your way to work, remember your ancestors survived by chewing on stale rye bread, drinking weak beer that tasted like hay, and sleeping next to a cow for warmth. If they could laugh through that, you can survive a drafty office or a lukewarm latte. Medieval winters may have been long, cruel, and endlessly monotonous, but they left us with a lasting lesson. Resilience, humor, and community can weather any storm, even if the storm lasts from October to April.